lab 4, my apologies, next part of the exercise, most flexible. Developer's point of view, they look completely different. They don't look like my apologies to whoever I'm cutting off. I'm hoping we'll have time at the end of the day that you can go back to any lab that you didn't have a chance to finish. But I'm concerned that if I don't go on, then there won't be a question of having time at the end of the day. It'll be a question of having course left over at the end of the day. And I would prefer not to have that happen. All right. So let's talk about other ways you can extend your application. Now, up until now, with JavaScript in our pages, in our forms, and with creating new components, we've been extending our user interface. What we're going to look at now is extending the Dataverse itself. So we're going to look at your options here, and we've seen most of these slides before, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. And then we're going to talk about the two kinds of plugins you can create. From the way Microsoft describes them, apparently these two kinds of plugins, one is in addition to the Dataverse that lets you add additional processing when anyone accesses a table in the Dataverse, and the other one is a way of adding new actions to creating new actions that you can use in your Power Automate. And Microsoft keeps talking about them as if they were just variations on the same thing. Certainly from a developer's point of view, they look completely different. They don't look like they have anything in common. So when you're reading about these, when they say, oh yes, well, they're just variations of the same thing, I would encourage you to ignore that because it's not helpful. I think we see some of that in the slide. So here's the slide about the Dataverse again. And again, another slide about how there's an API that you can use to access the Dataverse, RESTful API. You can access the Dataverse from any application. And if you looked at the code that you put in your component, you will have noticed that you use the XRM utility to retrieve rows out of a table in the Dataverse. And it's just XRM and a couple of function calls, and it's taken care of. It's a little bit more complicated if you don't use XRM, but fundamentally you're just calling a web service. And one of the things we're going to talk about in the last chapter, chapter 10, we're going to talk a little bit about creating a client that has nothing to do with Power Apps, that is calling that API and the kind of thing you have to do. So we are going to look at, we've talked about custom connectors. We've seen how we can add JavaScript to the events in our pages. Now what we're going to do is talk about these plugins. Now, one kind of plugin that we can put in is, and I like the use of the phrase pipeline here, that when your application accesses a table in the Dataverse, it's actually going through a series of steps, which they refer to as the pipeline. And most of the items in that pipe, and again, when the data comes out on its way back to you, it again goes through a series of steps, which they refer to as the pipeline. And most of that pipeline is built for you, and there's nothing you can do about it. But if you want, you can add additional components to the front end of the pipeline and to the back end of the pipeline. And those components go in very specific spots. In fact, it'd probably be a more accurate description if I said you're adding stuff in the pipeline, on the input pipeline, in two places, and with some processing in between, and then actually retrieving the table data, and then you can add to the pipeline as the data comes back to the client that requested it. This is not a complete list of the options you have in tying into the pipeline. When someone accesses the table, they could be accessing the table for a variety of different things. They could be accessing the table in update mode. They could be accessing the table in read. They could be accessing the table in read multiple. And those are listed as events. They're described as messages. And what you do is when you add something to the pipeline, you can include, you can specify that you only want this code that you're adding to the pipeline, this component, this plugin you're adding to the pipeline, is only to be run for certain kinds of messages. For instance, only when someone is retrieving single or multiple rows, or only when someone is deleting a row. And again, you might use this to coordinate activities with some other system. Or if you're deleting a row from this system, I want to go and delete it from this other system also, and so on. You'll notice down here, one of the things we talked about when we talked about creating relationships is that some relationships don't always have to be present. The idea, maybe you can have a sales order that doesn't have a customer associated with it. And that's where these two crop up. Associate when you're tying a sales order to a customer, and disassociate when you say, oh, this sales order doesn't belong to any particular customer. That's probably not a good example, because probably in your organization every sales order would have to belong to a customer. But, if you want to keep it around for data analysis purposes, even if that customer has gone away, that might be one thing you would do, is disassociate it from the customer and then delete the customer. But this isn't a complete list. There are other messages. These are sort of the big 7 or 8. The 7 or 8 you're most likely to want to respond to. And then, so first off, what kind of message? And then probably the equally important is where, which table is being accessed. So typically, you will, when you add a plug-in to the data pipeline, you will say, oh, when it's this kind of operation on this table. Now, you don't have to specify that. You could set up a plug-in that responds to any request on any table if you wanted to. But one of the things to remember is if you add a plug-in, you're adding additional processing to the pipeline. You're slowing down the pipeline. So the more messages it responds to, the more tables it responds to, then the more operations it's going to be contributing to, I grant you, but also the more operations are going to take longer because of this. So typically you want to target it for a specific operation. So, it's important enough to me to add this processing here that I want to target it. I'm willing to pay the cost of having this code run. So so first thing is, as I say, back here, there's a couple of different places in the pipeline where you can add processing. So you specify the message, the kind of processing you want to add some functionality to, you specify the table it goes to, and then you specify where in the pipeline you want it to occur. And pre-validation occurs very early in the pipeline. And as the name implies, it's before it's checked the data in the pipeline, data that's being used to make sure that the data is in fact good to be added to the table. It's even before authentication and authorization has happened. It's before making sure that you do in fact have the permission to perform whatever operation, or that this is a row that you have access to. So that it hasn't even checked for your privileges. Are you allowed to do an update? It hasn't even checked for your access. Are you allowed to work with this row? So it's very early. But one of the things you will typically do in a plugin is, because what you want to do is turn back some kinds of requests, that you want to check the data and you want to say, oh no, we don't want to do this. We don't want to allow this. And you want to have that happen as early in the process as possible. Because everything else takes up resources and takes up processing time. So if this thing is a bad idea, you want to reject it as early in the process as you can. Then you have the pre-operation event. And by the time you get to here, it is checked authorization, So it's checked privileges, it's checked access. It's done at least, I think the data rules have been processed at this point. It's done a lot of the processing here. Basically, it's going to write this row to the table. It's going to delete this row from the table. Basically, whatever the operation is, it's going to go ahead. So typically what you do in the pre-validation, as I sort of implied, is that you're looking for stuff that's wrong, that you don't want to let this operation go ahead. Now notice there's other ways you could handle this, right? You could do it with business rules, for example. You could write code in your application to do these kinds of checks. The problem is if you write code in the application and there's more than one application that works with this table, that code might be in one application and not in another application. That's sort of the beauty of business rules, right? And you can generate errors with business rules. But you may say, oh, I just can't figure out how to do this with business rules. If I could figure out how to do it with business rules, it would really be big and ugly. I can just write some C# code and create a little class file, and it'll work, and everybody will understand it. Generally speaking, you should assume that if you can do it in business rules, it would be better to do it in business rules because business rules is integrated in the platform is a little bit more efficient than any external code that you add. But if you can't do it in business rules, this is your choice. And then pre-operation, as they say here, typically this is what you're doing because you want to change some values of what's going to the table. So, for example, perhaps some fields are being updated and other fields are not, and you want to put in some default values into those fields to make sure that those fields are in fact written out the way you want. Perhaps there's some decoding operation you want to go through that, they say they're putting this in this field, but we really don't want them to put this value in. We want them to put in this other value instead. So this is your last chance to affect what happens to the table. You might, for example, if it's a delete, you might say, oh, okay, well, if it's going to delete this row, I also want to delete these other rows. Now, there's actually a better operation for that kind of thing. If you're looking at coordination, there's actually a better operation for that, and that's the post operation. When the post operation happens, the table has been updated. In other words, everything has succeeded. And there is the possibility that after the pre-operation, when it actually goes to write out to the table, something could still go wrong and the operation might not succeed. So if you're doing a coordination operation, you don't want to coordinate unless you know the operation has succeeded. So that is your post-op. That code should really go in post-operation. This is also what data is going back to the user. So this gives you the opportunity to enhance or modify, going back to the client, I guess I should say. This gives you your chance to modify or enhance whatever it is that's going back to the client that triggered the operation in the first place. So I see post-operation as your opportunity to do coordination. I see post-operation as your chance to enhance what the client sees. Now notice for post-operation and coordination stuff, as we demonstrated yesterday with our Power Automate exercise, you can do that with Power Automate too. And that's, again, it's a platform kind of thing. But there are issues with Power Automate potentially. Now you notice ours happened immediately, right? When we made the change to the inspection and the permit got updated virtually instantaneously. But there is that possibility that could take as much as 2 hours before your Power Automate process actually kicks off, if it's tied to an event. If it's absolutely essential to you that you be as close to real time as possible, you might want to put that code in a post-operation event. But again, and I know I've said it before, I'm going to say it one time, remember, every piece of code that you put into any of these events slows down the processing. It's going to take up time and resources. Except for the post-operation event. The post-operation gives you the option of not slowing things down. That's what they call execution mode. When you set up one of these things and say, for this kind of operation, this message, on this table, you can specify whether the processing is synchronous or asynchronous. Now, if it is asynchronous, it's not going to hold up the processing. In other words, your code will execute in parallel to whatever processing goes on. If it's synchronous, then everything has to wait until your code finishes running. Here's the problem. The only operation the only event that you can mark as asynchronous is post-operation. That's the only one you can mark as asynchronous. Let's go back to my example. And you can see why that is. If you could mark this as asynchronous, if you could mark that first one as asynchronous, well, then processing would carry on. And remember, what are you doing in the pre-validation? What are you doing is you're typically checking to see if this update should go ahead. Well, if the update is going ahead while you're doing the checking, you've sort of defeated the purpose. In the pre-operation, you're trying to change what goes into, typically you're trying to change what goes into the table. Well, if the change to the table is going ahead while you're updating, it's not going to end. It's not going to do you any good. So pre-validation and pre-operation are both, you can't mark them as asynchronous. However, this one you can mark as asynchronous. Now again, if sending the data back to the user is going ahead while you're trying to change the data that's going back to the user, that's not going to work out. So if in fact what you're doing is altering the message that's going back to the user, you probably want to leave that as synchronous, right? So that what goes back to the user is the result of your change. However, if what you've put in here is some coordination activity, well, fine. Let that coordination activity happen asynchronously, in the background, and don't let it hold up this process. Let that go ahead. And so there will be scenarios where you will want to mark the post-operation event as an asynchronous operation. Now again, I have to say, as always, so far as I know, and the last time I checked, the only operation you could mark as asynchronous was the post-operation, stuff tied to the post-operation event. That may have changed, but I don't think so. So synchronous mode, they will run as soon as the pipeline stage is raised, so as soon as you get to that event, and the entire operation will not proceed until the logic has completed execution. And that's pre-validation, and that's pre-operation. Asynchronous mode, it's dispatched as a system job, and this is we referred a couple of times to this background process that checks for things and does roll-ups and kicks off your automate things that are tied to changes, automate flows that are tied to changes in the Dataverse. That's all handled through this part of the Power Platform called the asynchronous service. And so what it does is it takes whatever you're processing, it says, hands it over to the asynchronous service and says, get around to doing this as soon as you can, okay? Which means if you're busy changing the message that goes back to the user, it's pointless because the message has already gone back. So, last time I checked, to the best of my knowledge, this only makes sense for coordination activities. It doesn't make sense for stopping processing. Asynchronous doesn't make sense for changing the values going back to the user. It doesn't make sense for changing the values going into the record. So it only makes sense for coordination activities. Coordination activities should be happening in the post-operation so that you know the change has successfully been made to the environment, and we're off to the races. All right, so let's talk about creating plugins. Plugins are code. Remember we made that distinction yesterday between declarative code, which is working with functions. I guess it was a couple of days ago. Made that distinction, working with functions, and writing every step out. Notice this is still a question of degree. It's not a sharp description. This is the first function I want performed, semicolon. This is the second function I want performed, semicolon. This is the third function. This looks like programming to me. This looks like, writing a sequence of steps. That's what they described as imperative logic. It's procedural logic. It's just the steps are really a lot of functionality built into the steps. But with a plugin, you're going to have to write code, typically in C#, because you're looking for very small, you're looking for the kind of fine-grained functionality that lets you do anything you want. So what can you do? You can cancel the event and display an error to the user. What you do is you actually raise a particular kind of exception. There's you can raise a specific exception, and whatever message you put in that exception that you raise, that error that you raise, whatever message you put in there will be sent back to the client. And hopefully the client will display the message to the user. Now, Canvas-driven applications are set up to do this. Model-driven applications are set up to do this. So all the PowerApp stuff are set up to look for those messages and put them in the notification area for that. But if someone were to write a client that uses the API to update this table, and your pre-validation code were to send back a message, it would be that message will go back to the client. Whether or not the client will show it to the user is going to depend on, how that client is written. So that saying the error goes back to the user would be, I think, is too broad. We should be saying it goes back to the client. The PowerApp clients, all those clients who keep PowerApp, they will grab that. They will recognize that exception. They'll grab that message. They'll show it to the user. Other clients that you might write may not. So you do this when you want to control the change that is being made, and as I say, when you want to initiate other actions. Now, what is this organization service that suddenly raises its head here? The organization service is the old web service API that was exposed to the outside world. If you wanted to write a program that manipulated the Dataverse, you would talk to the organization service. It has been replaced with the new, exciting service that we've been talking about this week. Actually, I shouldn't say replaced. And that they refer to as the Web API. Really, its full name is the Dataverse Web API, but they almost always just call it the Web API. Now, I'm told it actually hasn't been replaced. I'm told that the Web API under the hood is still doing everything through the old organization service, right? They didn't replace it. They just put this RESTful Web API front end on it that you can call. And XRM, that's what XRM works with. It works with the Web API. So, and I would suggest that's what you want to do, that you don't want to use the organization service. Microsoft has gone to a great deal of trouble to build this new front end in front of the organization service. And one of the reasons you do that kind of thing is so you can make changes to the organization service and it won't affect any clients, right? Because nobody's using it. Everybody's using the Web API, so they can change it, maybe even get rid of it. So I encourage you, don't talk to the organization service, talk to the Web API. And we'll talk a little bit about that, as I said in Chapter 10. Remember that you have other choices. You can create workflows using Power Automate. You've got calculated and roll-up columns. You can create, as we're going to talk about in this chapter, you can create your own actions and use them in a Power Automate flow. So really, there's only two solutions here, right? There's create a Power Automate flow or use calculated and roll-up columns, since custom actions are only available to you within your Power Automate flow. So plugins perform better when you consider performance. You want to make them run as fast as possible. A well-written plugin will always be the most efficient way to apply business logic. It's certainly more efficient than Power Automate. It will certainly use fewer resources than a Power Automate flow, and you're guaranteed to have it run immediately, close to real time, as opposed to Power Automate flow, which doesn't give you those kinds of guarantees. I suspect, I've been told that business rules work faster than the equivalent C# code. I don't know if that's true, but I was told that by someone who I think would know. Then an equivalent C# plugin that the business rule would work better. The business rule also integrates with model-driven applications, and even canvas-driven applications in a way that your code cannot. So if you wanted to control the user interface in a power-driven application, the most efficient way to do that would be use a business rule. But it is certainly more efficient than doing it with Power Automate. As a result, if you can't do something with declarative business logic, if you can't do it with, or the solution be too big and complicated, you can't do it with business rules, can't do it with Power Automate, or you're worried about performance issues with Power Automate, then plugins is the way to go. And if you want to make sure the process doesn't go ahead, if you want to make sure you cut it off before it carries on, but then business rules do that too. So they're saying my story I keep telling you and you're sick of hearing, and that is use the native functionality first, and then if that isn't working, by all means go ahead and write some C# code. And my primary reason for saying that isn't based on efficiency or performance. My primary reason for saying that is the next developer probably doesn't have a lot of experience with creating developers. And by not a lot, I mean probably creating plugins, I should say. And by that, I mean probably they have zero experience. And so as a result, and they may not even be aware the plugin exists, so they're getting this bizarre error message that they've never seen before, and they're going, where the heck is this coming from? And of course, it's being generated by this plugin you've created and added to the processing chain for this table. How will they know that? And so now you've got to write documentation. And then that documentation's got to be updated. And then the developer who comes along after you has to read that documentation. So I'm a big fan, as I say, of listing off all your components. And this plugin would be one of the things you should list off and give it a really meaningful name. So someone's scanning down and going, oh, this thing, by its name implies that it does something with access to this table. I think that would be very useful. But the chances, this is just sort of off to the side. Chances of someone not knowing about it are very high. So if you can't do it with a business rule, then this is your fallback. Can't do it with business rule, and you can't do it with Power Automate, or Power Automate doesn't meet your performance concerns, then this is the way to do it. Here's this table we've seen before, and I walked through the workflow options. This is the plugin options. And they say, notice right at the top, they say, can it be synchronous? And they say either. I mean, can it be synchronous or asynchronous? Well, yes, it can be asynchronous, but only for post-operation. Can you access external data? Yes, you can. You can from your plugin do anything you want, basically. You don't even have to go to the Dataverse API. You could call a completely different web service if you wanted to. Or even access your SQL Server database, if that made sense. They say over here workflows can't access external data. That's not even remotely true. You can, in fact, access external data from a workflow. However, this is very definitely true, and that is this is something that can only be maintained by a developer, while a workflow, a power user could, you could reasonably expect that you could have a power user who is both creating workflows and managing them for you. The creating this plugin, you do have to be a licensed PowerApp developer. It doesn't run on demand. It is triggered by the process. Can you nest child processes? Sure. You can call anything you want from your code. An execution stage, this is where the before-after really makes sense. I don't know what they mean with Power Automate. Something happens before and after. Well, you literally cannot set up a Power Automate solution to say, I want this to run just before somebody updates the row. You can't. All of the options are after somebody has updated, deleted, modified, inserted a row. So I don't know why they say, I'm sure whoever wrote this slide knew what they meant. I have no idea. However, a plugin, you can certainly put stuff in the two events at the front end of the pipeline, and you can put something in the back end. And as I said, that list of events is not complete. For instance, one of the events you can respond to is the status change. Remember the status reason and status code, they're special. And if someone is changing the status reason and the status code, the Dataverse is set up to treat those fields special. And as a result, there's an event that fires for a status change. You can wire up to that. So here's one of these slides where they talk about custom workflow extensions and plugins together as if they were somehow related. And the only thing I can think of is if you were to drill down through the code that implements this, you would find some similar functionality, and the developer who set up these workflow extensions and plugins knows that. And so from the developer's point of view, the person who created this system, they're somehow or other related. And you'll notice they say here that workflow extensions, and when we talk about workflow extensions, we mean creating new actions that you can use in a workflow, are a derivative of plugins. This is news to me. And if there's any relationship between workflow and custom actions and plugins, it certainly isn't obvious to someone who is building either of them. Right off the bat, if you want to create a plugin, what you do is you create a plugin and you implement not the iPlugin base, you implement the iPlugin interface. So you create a class and you add the iPlugin base interface to it, and that's going to force you to add some methods to your class. And the plugin infrastructure requires your class to have these interfaces. It requires you to have these methods. It is looking for these methods with these names, and by applying that interface, you're guaranteed that your class has the methods that the plugin infrastructure is looking for. On the other hand, if you want to create a workflow extension, what you do is you inherit from a base class called CodeActivity. And the CodeActivity class has a whole bunch of built-in functionality that you need to work with the workflow system, with the PowerAutomate system. And so you have to build on top of the CodeActivity class because you need all that built-in functionality. Plugins, you don't necessarily inherit from anything. You simply have to have the right methods. But workflows, PowerAutomate, you have to inherit from. You have to inherit the base functionality. So let's talk about what workflow extensions look like. Now, and remember when you created that PowerAutomate yesterday, PowerAutomate flow yesterday. Remember when you created the flow, it popped up and it said, here are the parameters you have to provide. And we had that form, and you filled in some parameters. And the parameters all consisted of a box for you to type stuff in, and then a label. So when you create your extension, you have to set your extension up so that when you create, I'm going to call it an action from now on. When you create your own custom PowerAutomate action, you have to set up so that people using your action can configure it, that they can pass parameters to it. So the way you do that is you create a property, and that getSet indicates you're creating a property. It has to be of type inArgument, and then you specify the data type that has to be typed in. So this would ensure that if this is the text box that's created by this, so when PowerAutomate gets around and the developer adds your action to their PowerAutomate flow, so so they grab your action, they add it to their PowerAutomate flow, that panel opens up. On the panel is going to be a text box, and if the user types in FOUR, then PowerAutomate will say, no, I'm sorry, you got to type in an integer. And so the developer will presumably delete that and put in 4. But of course you want to generate the label over here also. And that's what this does. This is what's called an attribute. and it's a way of passing information to whatever application is using your class. This input attribute passes information to the Power Automate framework. And the Power, in this case, what goes in here is going to turn up as your label. So we're going to end up with integer input with a colon after it. Can I suggest it would be better off to have a name here that doesn't describe the data type? Because getting the data type right is going to be handled there, right? But instead, give it a label that indicates, what the business purpose is, or some description of the data, so the user has a clue what to enter. When we went on and we added other items to our Power Automate, we could grab outputs from previous steps. So we could grab from the step that was our trigger step, we could grab data from the record that triggered that step, the permit ID. To make data available, you create an out argument property. So again, we put this in to indicate that it's a property, and we declare it as a out argument. And again, we specify the kind of data that we're returning. Is it integer or whatever? Now, you can call these anything you want. The name of the property doesn't matter. Literally makes no difference to anybody. Notice in the user interface up here, there's no mention of the property's name. So give the property a name that makes sense to you. What matters is if you're going to use it to pass data back to the flow, you declare it as out argument. And then remember when we went to pick things, it said, oh, here's the names of all the different kinds of data that was being returned from a previous step in the flow. This is those labels come from here. So you put an output attribute on, and Power Automate uses that to generate the name. So if the user is creating, the developer is creating the Power Automate, oh, I want this thing from that previous step. And again, I would suggest, saying, oh, this is some integer output from my previous step is not helpful. You want to describe what its business function is so the user can pick it accurately. I don't want to leave you with the idea that these are optional. You do have to put the input attribute on your in arguments. You do have to put the output attribute on your out arguments. If you want, you can have you can declare your property as an in-out argument. And what that means is that it will, when the user drags your Power Automate action on, this thing will appear as one of the boxes that the user can type information in. And when they add another action farther on, then this thing will also appear as one of the items that they can choose and get data it's returning. And presumably this is a parameter that you're going to read at some point in your processing. And it's also, this is a property you're going to read at some point in your processing. And it's also a property that you're going to update. You're going to change the value. Otherwise, it's sort of useless as an output, I guess. So you have to provide both the input and the output attribute. This generates the label when the user adds it, and this generates the description of it when the user wants to use it in another step later on, that dynamic content option. So here is a typical argument. There's other attributes you can put on it. The required argument means that if the user doesn't provide a value, and notice this is an input, you would only use this on an input argument. If the user doesn't provide a value, then Power Automate user interface will flag it and it'll say, I'm not going to compile, I'm not going to build this, I'm not going to publish this until you provide a value for this input parameter. So make sure that the developer provides all the necessary inputs. And here we've got a property called deck input and a property called deck output. And you'll notice this is declared as decimal, and this is also declared as decimal. And again, I want to emphasize you can give it any property name you want. All these examples keep referring to the data type, and I don't want you to go away with the idea that the property name is constrained in some way or has to reflect. You can give the property name anything you want. So now, how do you get the data when your action is actually executing? When your action is actually executing, how do you get the data from the Power Automate environment? Well, one of the methods that you're going to be forced to add, one of the methods that is built into the base class is called execute. And when it comes time for your action to run, I'm just going to finish the slide and we'll take our break. When it comes time for your action to run, then what happens is it looks for a method, Power Automate infrastructure looks for a method called execute and calls that method. And that's where you put your, whatever you want your action to do, that's where you put the code, is in the execute method. So it's going to call that execute method, and it's going to pass that execute method a code activity context object. So this is another object whose name ends in context. And as you might guess from previous times when we've seen objects whose name ends in context, this gives you access to information in the environment. In this case, access to information inside the Power Automate flow that is executing. So, as I say, the base class has a method in it called execute, and that will be called. You're going to want to override it. You're going to want to replace it with your own version of execute, to put your code in it. So, how do you find out, how do you retrieve the information from this parameter? It's a little bit odd. What you do is from this property, I should say. What you do is you take the property, you'll discover the property because it's an in argument. Because it's an in argument. You notice the property type for this property is in arguments. In arguments have a method on them called context. So you pass it the context. All the data that's in Power Automate is sitting in this context object. So what the get method does is it goes rummaging through the context, looking for whatever was set up when the user added the action to the Power Automate flow. And then it hands you back the data. So the data isn't actually stored in this in argument. What the in argument does is it knows how to find the data in your context object. So you pass the context object to the get method of the in argument of the property, and it will go and find it and hand you back the data. So you don't just read the property. That would be far too simple. You retrieve it from the context, and now you can use it as you would. Now, let's say you wanted to update a property. You want to update an out argument. Very similar process. Out arguments have a set method, and you pass the set method the context. You pass it the context and the data you want. And what the set method does is it goes into the context, finds the place where the data should be put so that the next actions can find that data, and it updates that spot in the context with the. So again, an out argument doesn't actually hold the data. It just knows how to find where in the process flow's context the data should go. You pass it, again, the context object, and it shoves that data into the right spot. And now later on, when somebody wants it, they can, some other's action in the Power Automate flow wants it, they can pull it out. So, all right, let's take a break here, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about plugins. And then I don't think we have actually much to say. Okay, so I was wrong. We do have much more to say. And then we will, actually we've got quite a lot to say. And then you're going to get a chance to create both a plugin to work with the Dataverse, and you will get a chance to create a custom workflow action, and create actually a Power Automate flow to use it too. So, and that'll probably take us until after lunch. And then when we come back after lunch, we will cover chapters 9 and 10. And there are no labs in chapters 9 and 10. Well, there is a lab in chapter 10, but we're not going to do it because it requires your. All right. See you in 50.
I think you're muted.
Of course I'm muted. Anyway, so I think this is, the rest of this chapter is about, not, as I remember, of course, as I say, I thought there was like 3 slides left. The rest of this chapter is nothing about, except about custom actions you can add to a workflow. I think we've said everything we're going to say about adding plugins to the Dataverse. So when they say things like plugin execution context, we're talking about workflow actions, right? We're not talking about that feature you can put in the Dataverse. So here's what the typical class looks like. You inherit from that code activity class, and you make sure you override the execute method, so it's calling your version of the execute method. And Visual Studio, and we're going to do this in Visual Studio, by the way, not in Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code will write out the whole method for you. You just type override, hit the space bar. It'll give you a list of all of the methods that you've inherited from code activity that you can override. One of the methods that will be in that list will be execute. Click on execute, hit the tab key, and it'll write out the skeleton. So you type in override, space, pick execute from the drop-down list, and tab, and you're off to the races. And when that method, when the infrastructure gets around to it, it will call your execute method, and it will pass you this code activity object. Remember, you set up your workflow, and maybe you got a vacation approval workflow. There can be 2, 3, 4, 1 million people simultaneously requesting the vacation. So there's multiple copies of your workflow running potentially at any time. And the Power Platform has to keep them all separate from each other. So you can retrieve information about your workflow, specifically about your instance of the workflow that's running. And you can find out, for instance, what's the name of your workflow. You can find out the unique ID that's been assigned to your instance of this workflow. And the way you do that is through an object that implements an interface called iWorkflowContext. They won't tell you what the class is. They'll only tell you that whatever class it is, it implements this iWorkflowContext interface. And Microsoft does that, and they do that a lot these days. They really like this because it means that they can have a variety of different classes that they can use here, just as the class evolves over time. But they don't have to keep telling you to update your code. We're now using Workflow Context version 4, Workflow Context Plus, or Workflow Context New. They're not going to tell you what the class name is. they're going to simply tell you that whatever class it is, it implements this interface called iWorkflow context. And you can apply an interface to any class you want. So as a result, from our point of view, we don't know what the name of the class is, but we don't care. We know that it implements this interface, so we know all the methods and properties that it has. I guess that's all we care about. We don't have to know the class name. So to get whatever class it is that implement, you can tell I feel a little ticked that they won't tell me what the class name is. Anyways, to get whatever class it is that holds all this nifty information and implements the iWorkflow context interface, you go back to that activity code context object and you call it get extension method. Worst method name ever. You call the extension method, and what it does is it gives you this workflow context object, which has a whole bunch of information about the workflow itself. There are some other attributes that you can put on your input and output parameters. There is a default attribute that you can put on, and if the remember we saw the required argument that forces the developer who's creating the workflow to put a value into that text box. Default allows you to say, okay, well, if the developer doesn't put in a value, set it to this value. And I think, as a matter of fact, the default value will appear in the text box. The user will have to erase it and put in whatever they want. Reference target. This is when you're expecting the user to provide you a reference to another table. We actually did that when we put our permit. Sorry, I'd lost my mind there. I kept thinking prime. When we put that permit in, that was actually a reference to the permit table. And so what it did was when it saw that, it actually went out and retrieved the permit table. And you'll notice that was what the property was called, permit. Now, remember what it does, from a practical point of view, it means in that inspections table, there is a column called permit that holds the unique identifier. But in Power Automate, when we drag in permit, what we are dragging in is actually a reference to the permit table. And this attribute target, this defines, allows you to specify a table and an attribute in that table. Now, typically the reason you use this is because you want to specify a specific column in the table because it's an option set. That column is an option set. So you're setting this up. You're being very dogmatic about this. You're being very controlling about this. You're saying the value you put in this particular property has to be a value from this option set on this table. So what will happen here is the user, instead of getting a text box, they can type in whatever they want. The user is going to get a drop-down list of this particular option set from this particular table. Now, you could use it for anything, I guess. You could say, oh, I want, well, the value in here has to be this attribute, this column from this. Remember, they tend to use the word column and attribute interchangeably. Actually, they tend to use column, attribute, and property interchangeably when they're talking about tables. I'm trying to stick with column all the time. But I suppose you could say, there's nothing stopping you from saying this table, this column, and the value from that column would appear there. Why are you asking the user to enter it then if you're fixating on that? So typically the reason you do it is because what you actually want, you're specifying an option set column, and you want the user to pick from the option set. There's a bunch of, as I say, other information you can get if you wish. What happens is when Power Automate runs, it runs in what we call it runs with what we call a dependency inversion container. And a dependency inversion container makes available to you a whole bunch of objects. And you can pluck those objects out of the dependency inversion container and use them. In fact, that's actually what you're doing here. when you specify a object type here, what happens is when automate goes to run the execute method, it looks at this at that class type, and then it goes to its dependency inversion container, which I always think of as a big box filled with a whole bunch of objects. And it goes through that box looking for the one object that is a code activity context. And so it's always actually pulling from that dependency inversion container. Well, one of the things that's sitting in the dependency inversion container is a class that implements the iServiceProvider interface. And again, they won't tell you what the class is. They say, actually, I know this one. This is actually currently is a class called Service Provider. But they figure they might want to change it and replace it with a different class, and that class will also implement the iServiceProvider. So in the execute method, you can put in an interface or a class name of anything that's in the dependency inversion container. Of course, we have no clue what that is, but you can certainly ask for them. Anyways, so instead of asking for the code activity context, what you can ask for is one of the objects in that box, and one of the objects you can ask for is iServiceProvider. Now, why would you ask for that? The reason you ask for that is the iServiceProvider is a special object. It is sort of it's a cool object. What the service provider does is it can find any other object in the dependency inversion box and give it to you. So it allows you to retrieve other items in the box. So if all you need is the code activity context, and by and large that's all you need, just ask for that in the execute method. However, if you think there's going to be a variety of different objects that you might want that are available in the Power Automate, how you'd know what those were, I don't know, then instead of asking for code activity, ask for iServiceProvider. And that will give you the service provider object. It'll go and find that and pull it out of the dependency inversion. It has a method on it called getService that lets you ask for any other object. Now, it'll only work if that object's in the dependency inversion box, but lets you ask for any other object in the container. And you do that by class name. So this is the class we're looking for is something that implements iPlugin execution context, and type of converts it into a format that getService understands. It actually goes and retrieves the type object for that interface, and then the type object, it does this, pretend you care. Anyways, you put in the thing you're looking for. It can be an interface name. It can be a class name. You have to put type of in front of it because getService is looking for a type object, and it will go and find that item. Now, getService, you'll notice, could return anything, right? Could be anything sitting in that box. And you could ask for anything. So the getService method returns type object. So you have to tell the world what kind of object you retrieved. You have to put in a cast here to say, by the way, what I'm getting out of here is an iPlugin execution object. And then you can store it in here if you wish. I've always been happy. A couple, 3 times, I guess half a dozen times. Half a dozen times. I've created a custom automate flow object. Everything I've needed has been in the code activity context. So I'm aware of this existing. I haven't needed to use it yet. Now, the iPlugin execution context gives you access to input parameters and output parameters. We already had that, right? We have that by setting up our input and output parameters, and those are available to us through the code execution context. So However, if you want to retrieve stuff that way, you can go with input parameters and then the name of the property, and that will retrieve the item, and then you'll have to do, again, it could be anything you're pulling out of this, so you have to do a cast to retrieve it. And this is, if you're wondering why it's entity, this is how you could pull a table out of the context of this. Now, as I say, when I'm doing this, I'm always thinking in terms of custom actions in the Power Automate flow. But this is one of the things that does connect plugins and Power Automate. You can, this will give you the ability to, in a plugin object, to retrieve other stuff from the dependency inversion box that's associated with running your plugin. So this gives you the ability to retrieve other things from that, including input parameters and output parameters. Why would you use this? Well, you'd use this because this is, and it's a bad idea. You don't want to do this, okay? But you would do this because in the pre-validation, this is how you would retrieve the row that is being updated, the table that is being updated by this action in pre-validation. So target is the table that is being updated in this process. Output parameters, you'd use that in the post operation to retrieve the table as it's going back to the user. But I wouldn't use this if I were you. And the reason I wouldn't use this if I were you is this is tremendously inefficient. It's just, I gather it's just really slow. So what on here is valid? What on here is valid, let's say that you are writing a plugin and you want to access some data on the way in because you want to check it to make sure it's okay, or you want to alter it before it goes into the table, or in the post-operation you want to modify before it goes back to the user, or you want to do some coordination activity. In the pre-validation, you want to retrieve the values that are going into the table. So this is no use to you. In the pre-validation, you want to know what is the user putting into the table. This would give you access to the table. Not much help to you in pre-validation. What is useful on this page in pre-validation, if you want to stop processing, that is the name of the exception you want to throw. That and whatever error message you pass to that exception, that's what will go back to the user. So that's what's useful on, as far as pre-validation goes, that's what's useful. I suppose it could be useful to you if you need to look at what's already in the table to check it against the thing that's being added to the table, maybe to prevent a duplicate item being added to the table. You might use this to retrieve the table so that you could check that item. Anyways, but I think the key thing on this slide is, in fact, they finally break down and tell you the name of the exception object, the exception you should raise if you want to stop processing. And here's output parameters. And this is something you would do in the post-operation stage to see again, the table, the target, to retrieve the table that has just been updated. But again, this is terrifically inefficient, and I wouldn't do it this way. Instead, what you want to use are pre-entity images and post-entity images. Now, when you create a plugin that's going into the Dataverse, one of the things that you have to do is you have to register your plugin so that it knows it exists and use it. I mean, you can create your plugin in Visual Studio and you can upload it to Power Platform and nothing will happen. You have to register it, and that's what says, oh, okay, I'm going to use your plugin. I will actually incorporate it into the pipeline. When you register it, one of the things that you can do is specify pre-entity image, that you want pre-entity image and post-entity images. And this gives you a view of the entity before the update and after the update. And this is terrifically efficient. This is the right way. If, in fact, you need to look at the entity either as a whole, either before or after. And again, as I say, I've never needed to do this, right? I'm only interested in the data that's going in and then what data is going back. It's not the whole table that's going back. It's just this, this row that's going back. But, in any case, if you need to look at the whole entity, register to get pre-entity images and get post-entity images, part of registering it, and then retrieve that, and then in that context object, ask for pre-entity images or post-entity images. When you register to say, I want you to generate post-entity images, you have to say, what do you want your pre-entity image to be called? What do you want your post-entity image to be called? And it seems to me calling them pre-image and post-image is not a bad naming convention. So if you do need, for whatever reason, to look at the whole table, either on the way in or the way out, create pre-entity and post-entity. Now, one of the reasons you want to do this, now notice back here, if I go this route and go to output parameters or input parameters and ask for, whatever entity is being updated and use the word target for the entity to be updated, I have to retrieve the whole entity. One of the beautiful things about pre and post images is that you can ask for individual columns. And my guess is if you're doing this at all, you're not interested in the whole row. You're only interested in that particular column. So this is a far more efficient way. Notice it's row-oriented rather than table-oriented. It is far more efficient than going after the whole entity. It is, and that's because the system knows you're asking for it. By registering for pre and post entities, it knows, you want to look at this stuff. It'll do it beforehand. And it allows you to retrieve it on a column-by-column basis rather than the whole darn thing. Yeah, Stephen.
Hey, yeah, what you highlighted there in blue, the pre-image, in that slot, does that let you access any entity or just the one that you're trying to?
You're exactly right. Just the one you're trying to update. You're exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah. If you want to access some other entity, I guess your only choice is to go through the web API and make a call to some other entity if you wanted to. And remember that name that you use there is a name that you make up when you register that you want the pre-image and the post-image. So don't just use pre-image. Make sure that when you register it, if you want this, check it off. Check it off and assign a name. By the way, again, this isn't free. There is some cost associated with it, so you should only check off that you want pre- and post-images if you are actually in your code. You want to see the row before you update it. And by the way, if you're doing an add, the pre-image returns nothing. And if you're doing a delete, the post-image returns nothing. So just be aware of that. Remember, at the start of the pipeline, you have a pre-image, but you don't have a post-image. And at the back end of the pipeline, you have both pre-image and post-image, but it can't give you the post-image until it's actually done the update. So just be aware that you might ask for these things, and they might not be there. The pre-image won't be there in the event of an add, and the post-image won't be there until post operation, and it won't be there if it's a delete. You can share variables in a plugin. It is possible to create a variable. I didn't realize quite how far back I was going. It is possible to create a variable Let me just clean this up a bit here. It is possible to create a variable that you update from every individual step. And furthermore, every time your plugin runs. So every time your plugin executes, if you work with this shared variable, the data will be here. So you could imagine, but you have to be careful here because concurrency kicks in. So you might say, oh, okay, well, in my pre-validate, I'm going to store something here, and I'm going to read it in my, down here, I'm going to read it in my post operation. But this is shared not only between all of the steps in the pipeline, it's shared with every time this plugin runs. So you might store something up here, and then somebody else might actually start the pipeline running. Some other process starts the pipeline running, because, popular table, many apps may be updating it, or your app might be running on but it might be simultaneously being run by multiple users. Somebody else runs it. By the time you get down to here, that second execution might have updated this to something completely different. And so now, in your post operation, you're not reading what was set by the pre-validation of you're reading what was set by the pre-validation of a process to start after you. So shared variables are really shared. They're shared among all three of the events, and they are shared across all the requests against that table. However, the good news is they're not shared they're only shared for that plugin, for that particular plugin. So you don't have to worry that if some other plugin is running and is busy updating a shared variable, that's not going to interfere. They are kept separate on a plugin by plugin basis. Again, this is not something I've ever used, and I think, as soon as you start sharing data and you've got multiple copies of something running, you start worrying about concurrency issues. Well, exactly kind of issue I just highlighted there. It's an accident waiting to happen. So, and in fact, the example they have here is you're trying to make sure that this plugin isn't run too often. So the plugin increments, every time the plugin runs, it increments the shared variable. And it also checks the value of the shared variable. If the shared variable is greater than 5, it throws that exception and says, well, I'm not going to run anymore. So, now, how the shared variable is going to get set back to 0, I'm not clear on. So I don't think you can ever run this plugin again until so I'm not sure this is a great example. It's just a bad idea. Just stay away. So it might make sense if you want to make sure I don't have more than 5 copies of this plugin running. So you might increment that plugin in the increment that shared variable in the pre-validation, and in the post operation you might decrement it. So it goes up every time somebody starts running this plugin, and it goes down every time the plugin finishes running. And you say, okay, well, currently there's 5 copies of this running, so I'm not going to let another one start. As the already running 5 copies finish, they will decrement it. I'm trying to come up with some example. Anyways, what are the kinds of things that you might want to retrieve from the dependency inversion box? One of them is this thing called the eye tracing service. And you might want to say, use get service so you can retrieve the eye tracing service. And that's got a bunch of methods on it that write to something called the plugin trace log. And again, remember, this thing is running underground. There's no user interface associated with this. And so what you're going to notice is people keep saying, I keep getting this exception message. Or the data that comes back is sort of surprising to me. Or the data that ends up in the table is sort of surprising to me. And I don't understand why. And of course, what's happening is your plugin is doing its job, and it's either raising the exception or altering the data, or you've got some coordination activity in post-operation. That coordination activity is not happening. And why? Well, your plugin is blowing up. How will you find that out? How will you track that problem down? And I would suggest that one of the things you're going to want to do is write to the log. And by the way, what will happen is in your objects, you will write to the trace log, and when you have a problem, you will go to the trace log and you will look at, here, what is the entry? We know this was accessed at roughly this time of day and it didn't work. Let's go and look at the trace log for this particular plugin roughly at that time of the day and see if we see any interesting messages there. And what you will find is you're not writing out enough log messages for you to diagnose the problem. Invariably, that's what happens. That when you actually need your trace log messages, you discover you're not writing out enough. But there's really no other way for you to track down the problem. You can't really debug these things. What I would suggest you want to do is, one, in your tracing, write out all your input parameters. So write out all the values. Two, put a try-catch block around everything. And write out all exceptions. You don't have to write out your start and end time, because that will be in the log. When the log messages will have a timestamp on them telling you written. But remember, write out a completed message. That tells you that you ran all the way to the end. It may seem dumb, but you'll go to the log file and you'll see a bunch of messages writing out all the parameters, and that indicates that your thing started running. How do you know it ran to completion? Well, you can get an exception message. Good. But that's not the same as knowing that you actually ran to completion. So I think it's good to write out a completed message. The other thing is, when you write out a completed message, that means in the log file there's going to be a timestamp saying when that, and that's the last line, that tells you when you finished. So that gives you some idea of duration. You can look at the very first timestamp for your very first message and your timestamp for the very last message, and you can say, oh, okay, what's the duration? There is a limit on how long a plugin is allowed to run. It's measured in seconds, but if a plugin doesn't finish within a certain period of time, PowerApps will kill it. And so this will tell you if your PowerApp was struck dead. Though that will raise an exception, your try-catch block will catch it. But I would suggest those are the first three things you want to log in your plugin every time. So that means you need to retrieve the eye tracing service from service provider. If you go and look at the synchronous service, it will list all of the jobs that it has processed. There is a profiler. There are stats being gathered about all the plugins you've added. So you can go and look at those stats. Those will be reported to you in the monitor windows. Power Platform Analytics. And by the way, the Profiler and Power Platform Analytics are both something available to you in the Power Platform Admin Center. So you can go to the Power Platform Admin Center and you can find all of these stats that are being gathered. Oh, there's the timeout. It's 2 minutes right there. I just looked a little bit farther down. So, and again, then you won't get your completed message, and that will tell you, oh, I got killed. So pre and post images. Now, you got to be careful here, all right? Up until, I was about to say last year, but up until near the end of 2019, you could only get pre and post images for the Dynamics 365 tables. And of course, half of us are not working with Dynamics 365. And even if you're working with Dynamics 365, I bet you're creating your own custom tables. And you could only get pre and post images for the Dynamics 365 tables. Late in 2019, they allowed you to start getting pre and post images for tables that are not part of Dynamics 365. Now, with the Dynamics 365, actually this goes back to what Stephen asked earlier on, and I didn't give you a great answer. with the Dynamics 365, you could register to get pre and post images of other tables, other Dynamics 365 tables. The last time I checked, I was not able to get pre and post images of custom tables, only of Dynamics 365 tables. I don't know that this slide is telling you the truth here. It may just be that you can get pre and post images of the tables of your choice, of other tables in the except for the Dynamics 365. So, but it's got to be a record that you've actually. So this prevents you from having to retrieve a record to look at it. So if you want to retrieve a record from another table, you can simply get this pre and post image. Again, it's much more efficient than any of your other mechanisms for looking at data. And if you think you're going to have to look at the rows, this is what you want to do. So make sure that you only run this plugin when you absolutely have to. So the more specific kinds of changes, specific messages, tie it always for a specific table. Use pre and post image to retrieve any data. Typically, this is going to be the row you're about to update. Do not register the plugin without specifying a table. Well, that's just more of this, right? Make sure that your operation doesn't take 2 minutes. I would suggest if your operation takes more than a couple of seconds, remember you're holding up that particular update to this table. If this is a table that's used frequently, if this is an operation that's done frequently, if you're going 2 minutes, people are already yelling at you. So check the depth of the transaction. Remember, if in your plugin, if your coordination activity is to update another table, and that table has a plugin associated with it, now you're slowing up the operation by running the code in your plugin and the code in the plugin on that table you're updated. You're now 2 levels deep in the transaction. You may want to check, and you can. One of the things you can retrieve from the context is what your transaction depth is. And you may want to check that and say, if I'm 4 or 5 levels deep, something's gone horribly wrong. What they're worried about here is you have a plugin that updates this table, and that starts a plugin in another table, and what that plugin does is it updates the first table, and of course now you're in an endless loop, right? Because the plugin is, you probably won't ever have this problem. But that's what they're worried about here, is that you're adding a row to another table, and that causes the plugin to run, that adds the row, and now your plugin runs again, and you can just carry on forever. So that's what they're worried about. And then handle all errors. Wrap your whole thing in a try-catch block. All your first line of code, even before you write to the trace file. The first line of code is as a try, and the last line of code is the end of the try block, even after the writing complete to the trace log, and everything happens inside a try-catch block. So here you're going to get a chance to create both a plugin and an extension. So both an addition to the actions you can use in your Power Automate flow and a plugin to control what happens to a table. But you have to be careful here. In the exercise, they're going to have you add some NuGet packages. And as it turns out, the last couple of times I've taught this course, as it turns out, the latest versions of the NuGet packages have issues either with each other or with the version of Power Automate that we're using. I've forgotten the details. But you have to be careful about when you go to pick the NuGet packages. Do not take the current versions of both NuGet packages, or it's not going to work out for you. Now, what's controlling this is which version of the .NET framework you're using. And when you start up Visual Studio and you create your project, it's going to pick a version of the .NET framework to run on. And I think these days, by forgotten what version of Visual Studio. It may even pick the latest version of .NET, which is .NET Core 5. That's not going to work out for you. So you want to make sure that when you create your project, it'll show you the version. In the upper left-hand corner, it's going to show you the version of the .NET framework you're using. If you forget this and you go all the way through and create the project, and you go, oh, I forgot .NET framework version. Right-click on your project, pick Properties, and then in the Properties window, there's a tab labeled Application, and that will show you your .NET Framework version, and you can change it. It gives you a little warning message about how it's going to shut down and start up Visual Studio. Don't worry about it. Just say, yeah, fine, go ahead. And make sure you are set to 4.6.1. So you've got to make sure the .NET Framework version for your project is set to .NET Framework 1. Then you're going to go get the NuGet packages. Actually, it's only one NuGet package. You're going to go get this NuGet package called Core Assemblies. The name is much longer than that, but it's Core Assemblies is part of the name. Again, don't take the latest version. Make sure you get the version 9.0.2.32. There's probably other versions that will work, but I have tested this exercise with 9.0.2.32, and I know it works with this. This is one of these exercises that just worked and worked and worked and worked and worked and worked, and all of a sudden I'm teaching this course and it blows up in everybody's face, and it's because they put a new version of Visual Studio on that was using a different version of the .NET framework by default, or there was a new version of the NuGet package put out, and the new version didn't work with whatever we were anyways. So I did some experiment and found what version will work together. There's probably other combinations that work. I'm just saying this version works. Now, hopefully they have an upgraded Power Platform in some way that this doesn't work anymore. So make sure you get .NET Framework. When you create your project, make sure that you set the .NET Framework to 4.6.1. And when you go get the NuGet package, don't take the latest version. When you get the NuGet package, on the right-hand side, it shows you there's a version list. Hit that drop-down list and pick the version 9.0.2.32. I'm not saying there aren't other versions that will work. I'm just saying that when I did my testing, this version worked. So, all right, I'm going to be quiet. We've got half an hour for lunch. We will take time after lunch for this. This is our last exercise. And so after this, the next two chapters, next two modules, 9 and 10, are nothing but me talking at you. You might want to have a lot of sugar and caffeine over lunch, and perhaps seriously consider sitting on a sharp object just to keep awake this afternoon. So let's go ahead and do this exercise. And if you do finish this exercise early, give me the green check mark. And if you want to go back and work on another lab, I think that would not be a foolish use of your time. All right, I'll be quiet. A UI control uh,
Hey, can you still see my screen, by the way?
uh, uh, other people's screens that went. Yeah, and it should be the entries. Um, it's self. Power Apps were intended for all the MSDYN stuff. Plainly, Contoso's not there. I can't. I suppose it's possible that whatever. I mean, this register step. I think it's actually a community tool. I suppose that whatever the first time you use it, no, that can't possibly be right. But the first time you use it, that screws. If you don't get it exactly right the first time you use it, it screws it up every time thereafter. Find that difficult to believe. I'm going to have to do some research. All right. So let's pretend those two problems didn't exist and keep going. So let's talk about PowerApp portals. And that will take us up to our, actually take us past our break. So we want to introduce you to the idea of the PowerApp portals. 1 second. Then we're going to talk about how you access the Dataverse from those portals. And then we're going to talk about how you extend PowerApp portals, and then how you can create your own templates. Now, along the way, we're going to introduce you to a whole new way of designing web pages. If you've worked in ASP.NET, ASP.NET MVC with the Razor engine, you've seen a way of merging HTML with dynamic content that is loaded at runtime from your database or whatever data you've retrieved. And Microsoft has developed a different tool for that, for you to use when you're creating your PowerApp portals. So the idea behind a PowerApp portal is that you can provide, and remember, PowerApps were intended to be used in-house. Their idea that you create applications that are used by your organization, staff, and employees. And you would, you don't need a license to use a PowerApp. You need a license to create a PowerApp, but you don't need a license to use PowerApp. But because you're rolling it out to staff and employees and stuff, these people are all set up in your Azure Active Directory. Now, your Azure Active Directory may just be a copy of your on-premises Active Directory. Microsoft has a tool that everybody uses called AD Connect, Active Directory Connect, that will grab the data out of your Active Directory and shove it into your Azure Active Directory and keep them in sync. And there's a lot of options there, and that's a different course. But the result of this is that by the time somebody gets to running your PowerApp, they will have been asked to log in by Azure Active Directory. Now, Azure Active Directory will detect that they're trying to get to a secured resource and make you provide a username and password. So you'll notice right off the bat, we're talking about you can provide them. So who is them in this case? And if we look over here, it's self-service support and empower employees and engage mobile workforce and build a sales pipeline. So these are all things that your staff would do, your employees would do, with the possible exception of building a sales pipeline. Because you're going to see one of the scenarios they talk about using this is to have your users come to your site and browse your catalog of products and then express an interest in buying a product. And then you would use that to kick off, this person is now what we call a lead, and now your salespeople would start harassing this person until finally they yell at you or move or buy something. But you'll notice the other three options: empower employees, provide self-service support, engage a mobile workforce. Those are all very much oriented towards your employees who are going to log in as part of accessing this page. But the idea is that you don't have to give them access to the PowerApp. You can give them access to the web browser, and they can do stuff from the web browser. But the idea is also that you can build a sales pipeline, and the scenario they talk about whenever they bring that up is that it's an external facing site, that you are in fact creating a site that anybody on the internet could get to. And you can see that showing up here when they say you want to create a branded site. And of course, if you're talking about, the internal stuff, it would be nice if it looked like it belonged to your company, but it's not critical. But if, on the other hand, it's an external website, then you're going to want to tailor it so it looks like all your other parts of your website, all your other websites. So we're going to see a certain amount of emphasis in this chapter on controlling the look and feel of the site and using CSS to get the pages to look a certain way. And they talk about here providing a way for users to search for knowledge, go through catalog. Now, what's interesting about going through your catalog, let's say you're keeping your list of products in the Dataverse, right? But going through your catalog is a read-only operation. So typically in read-only operations, you're not particularly concerned about security. You've wired up this web page to look at your product catalog, and so users can't use this page to get, for instance, to your employee information. So by restricting your site to specific tables and then putting them in read-only mode, again, you don't have to worry about the security thing. Well, what about if a user wants to buy something? Well, the buy option, you're actually creating you're not modifying an existing record. You're creating a new record. And again, depending on the entity, you may not particularly care if people want to create new records. You may be concerned if they're updating existing records. But again, whatever entity you tie this page to, you may be just fine with them creating new records. But of course, the user might put in an order and then change their mind, and then they'll want to go back and change an order, change the record. And again, you're probably okay with that if they created the record in the first place, if it's a record that's owned by them. So we're going to find, as we talk about this, security and authentication is going to come up in a way that it hasn't before. With the possible exception of talking about privileges and access rights, here we're talking about, can you get to the website at all? And if you can get to the website, what pages on the website can you get to at all? And we're going to have to talk about anonymous users, users who have not logged in. And what do we want to allow users who have not logged in? What do we want to allow them to do? And we might be perfectly okay with them creating records in a limited number of entities. Please send me email about your products. We'd love to do that. And changing records that they own. So the thing is, though, and the thing to remember is we are, in fact, creating web pages. The whole point of this process is to create what gets delivered to the browser are HTML pages. And so as a result, we can integrate that with the rest of our websites. You can put anchor tags and all that good stuff on. So PowerApp portals are built on top of the Dataverse, and the idea is to create, and you notice what they're talking about here, content management system out of the box with all the content stored in the database. And of course, your product catalog is probably the poster child for content management. It's data that doesn't see a lot of churn, doesn't get updated very often. It's content. So what you do when you're creating a portal is, they give you a bunch of templates that you can use to get started creating your portals. However, while I say a bunch of templates, only if you're using Dynamics 365. If you're not Dynamics 365, then the only portal you get is, they're not even going to show it here, is the one called blank. That's the only template you get. So you're allowed to create exactly one portal for each Dataverse environment that you set up. So what would that mean? That means we could create a portal for our dev environment, and we could create a portal for our production environment. So we would create the portal for our dev environment so we could experiment and try stuff out and screw with it, right? And then we'd publish it to our production environment. And that would be the portal for that particular production environment. And of course, if you're dividing up your environments on a departmental basis, that may make perfect sense. Here is our sales portal. Here is our products portal, and so on. But I can easily imagine that you might want to have a portal that covers several different departments. You'd have to create a special environment for it because accounting already has their portal. Inventory management already has their portal, and products already has their portal, and sales always have their portal. So we have to create a new environment that actually crosses all those environments, and so all of those different topics. So again, we've got a Power Apps Portal Studio, which is the editor, just like when we were working with Canvas apps. We had a Forms Studio that allowed us to create forms. In this Power Apps Portal Studio, we create web pages. Notice that's one word. In fact, you'll see a little copyright symbol beside it. So that's web pages. But web pages are actually generated from page templates. And a page template is sort of the overall structure of the page. And then from your page template, you create a web page. And typically what you do is you shove data from some table into the page template. So the page template says, okay, first name goes here, second name goes here, and so on. And then you grab the data and insert it into the template, and boom, there's your web page. They also have what they call content snippets. Content snippets are reusable pieces of text, reusable pieces of HTML that you can add to a template to extend the template. This makes perfect sense, right? Because there are going to be parts of your page. I had one client, Service Brands International, in Ann Arbor, and they run. You haven't heard of them, but they run a bunch of franchises. They run Molly Maid, they run Mr. Handyman, and there must have been 24 places on their website where we were either gathering or displaying address information. So in that kind of situation, the three things your users like best about a user interface, the three things I like best are consistency, consistency, and consistency. So you might create a code snippet for displaying address information, and then you'd copy and paste it into individual templates, You might have a copyright snippet that you want to use. You copy and paste it into templates, and then when someone requests your page, the data from the row they want out of whatever table you're working with gets shoved into the template, and that creates the web page. So how do you create a template? Well, typically you create a template by putting a table list let's do that, a table form on it. So we can recycle, at least in part, we can recycle the table lists and the table forms that we created for our model-driven applications. Those can be recycled into to create the templates that will be loaded with data. So here is your App Portal Studio. They have this command bar across the top, so that's our menu, what we call in the component the ribbon. We have the tool belt down the side. I've never heard that term used anywhere else. And the tool belt, there's a selection tool that lets you click and drag stuff. There's a tool for deleting stuff on the page, whatever. And then whatever you drag onto the page, which is referred to as the canvas, whatever you drag onto the canvas, if you click on it, you get all the properties for it. So this is a very familiar paradigm, right? This idea that there's a set of options down the left-hand side, and you create your page from them, and down the right-hand side shows you the detailed information, anything you want. When you create your web page, and I'll be talking about creating a template, interestingly enough, when you create the page, the base page actually already is a template. The base page already has a footer section and a header section. And in fact, when you go to create your web page, when you go to add a new web page, you'll see one of the options you have on it is to turn the header or footer off. And again, you can use this to, not suggesting it's a good idea, but you can use this to create web services. You can create a web app portal, and this, you don't have to go to any extra trouble to attach this to a URL. All web pages have a URL associated with them. So you create a web page, you turn off header and footer, and just make sure you return your data in JSON format. And there, you've got a web service. Again, I think we have better tools, but you can certainly do it. If you want, one way to think of this is that a URL leads you to a template. The data is retrieved and inserted into the template, and that generates the web page that goes down to you. And in fact, we're going to see later on in this chapter, there are tools for generating the HTML that make up the web page. So the HTML that ends up going around all your data, it can also be dynamically generated. And Microsoft has got a tool for you to do that with. So a web page is a document that is identified by a unique URL. And you can create parent and child relationships. And we've seen this before when we have a list and we click on an item in a list and it takes us to the form that displays that item. So you end up with a hierarchy. And here's a term we've seen before, which is a sitemap. So that kind of thing that we've seen before in our model-driven applications, this is the model we can use for creating our web pages. And in fact, I would be more inclined, as I say, to say that your web page leads you to a particular template. And you'll have a series of unique templates. And then we'll load them with the data. But as we're going to see eventually, I mean, how do we pick which row we're going to, what record is going to be displayed here? And the default is we put the ID of the record we want to display. That actually gets embedded into the URL. It actually, by default, it goes into the query string of the URL. So if you were to look at a URL that's displaying a page in a portal, you would see, your company's URL followed by the name of the template, name of the web page, and then question mark, and then cust ID equals whatever the unique identifier is, or and so that would all be there. So if that's the whole URL, then it is very unique because that URL describes this template loaded with the data from that particular customer ID. So what can you have in a page? You can have plain text, you can have some HTML, and you can have this new language that Microsoft has invented, which we'll see after the break, which allows you to generate HTML dynamically when the page is requested. As I say, by default, when you create your page, you can create, sorry, getting ahead of myself. So here, for example, is a page called Mobile Header, and you look at that and you go, well, that looks pretty much like what we get in a model-driven application. And in fact, if you thought you were going to use this in several different places, you could save it as a snippet. You could save it as a snippet and then use that with other templates. You might, if you had several different organizations, right, you might use it as a template to create different pages for each of your organizations, just updating the snippet with the logo. So, and you can edit your snippets as you go. So a snippet is a set of HTML and text and template instructions that you think you might want to use again and again, so you don't have to start from scratch every time. So what can you add? You pick an entity form. What can you add to a page to create your template? You pick from your drop-down list. You get entity forms. You get entity lists. You then pick your form and it'll give you a drop-down list of all the forms you've set up, and then it will generate some buttons for you automatically. For example, and so we have to specify the language that those buttons will be displayed in. Now you can add some additional actions to this. What do you want to allow the user to be able to do with this? And this is what's going to generate these buttons, is however many actions you pick here. Do you want if this is a list, do you want to let the user be able to go to the details for any item on the list? Do you want to let the user edit the item on the page, delete the item on the page, trigger a workflow, create a related record from a permit, create an inspection record, activate and deactivate the page? You're wondering what that does? That goes to your status code, and it changes your status code from active to inactive or inactive to active. And if you want to give the user the ability to update the status codes, are special. You can put buttons on whose sole purpose in life is to change the value of your status code property. And then down here you specify some additional information. Here's where you put the I've forgotten. This is where you down here. This is where you can specify additional information for each of these options that you've picked up here. Now, you want your page to look like something. And so the terminology here, again, there's a couple of terms they throw around almost synonymously. The word they use a lot is theme. And we go, okay, I'm familiar with themes. That was something I could pick to control the look, feel, appearance of my of the apps I've been creating. But the other word you'll hear them toss around is preset. And I think they're trying to phase that out. I think they're sorry they used that, and they want to switch over to using theme. But for instance, your textbook, the word preset crops up. So what they've done is they've said that the current terminology is the different kinds of themes are called presets. Well, I would say the different kinds of themes are themes, but the user interface, I think they're stuck with this because the user interface says preset, and they don't want to go around changing the user interface. So preset and theme, virtually synonymous. And you'll notice here they say change the theme for your portal, which means picking a different preset. And you'll notice, I think this may be the last place on these slides where you see the word preset, and it's all theme, theme, theme from here. So whenever you see preset, if you think theme, you won't be too far wrong. So one of the things that's happening here, I'm getting ahead of myself. Then next thing we have to talk about is authentication. And that's got us a 3 slides, and it's just about 2:30. Let's take our 50-minute break, and we'll come back and talk about authentication and authorization and how we're going to deal.
I cannot hear you, Peter.
You can tell well, never mind. I've been forgetting to turn my mic back on all week. I really don't want to talk to you guys. I think it's what we should take away from this. Anyway, so how are we going to handle authentication and authorizing users? Well, one of the things you can just do is use the contact table. That contact table that comes with the Dataverse, among other things, has columns in it for password that you can use to keep the user's password in. And they refer to that as local authentication. And portal management, the portal management model-driven app, which is available for you to use, gives you tools for managing passwords, viewing the information in the contact table that's relevant to managing users accessing these portals, like is the user locked out, and the contact table's got all this stuff in it. You don't have to do anything. And they also provide registration and profile pages so that someone can register themselves and add themselves to the contact table and so on. So that's one of your options. But Azure Active Directory also supports business to business. And the idea here is that you have business partners and they're going to be using parts of your applications. And you can set those users up in Azure Active Directory. You don't keep all the information about them, but what they do is they register with the partner organization. You have a trust relationship with the partner organization. And so you keep a minimal amount of information about them in your Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory also supports business to customer or business to client, or business to consumer. The C can stand for any of those things. What you do there is you actually create another copy of your Active Directory tenancy, and you use that to keep all of these users. Because, potentially, you've got a staff this big, and hopefully you have this many customers, this many consumers. You don't want to put them in your Active Directory because they're going to swamp your Active Directory. So you create this other separate Active Directory business to consumer. And clients, users will register, and they basically are adding themselves to this other Active Directory. And that falls under the category, believe it or not, if you decide to register, use Azure Active Directory to manage your registration. They call that external authentication. And that can be either using the business-to-business model if you have a small number of users who are using this site who are not in your Active Directory, you don't have to do any of this stuff if everybody is using this site is set up in your Active Directory. Everybody's staff member or employee, but the assumption is that some of them aren't. If there's a small number of business partners who are using this site, the B2B solution, perfectly reasonable way to go. You're probably going to eventually need it anyway. And Teams and SharePoint all have the idea of guest. This is something that, this business partner is something that runs through all of Microsoft's tools, and this is another example of that, or business to consumer. Or you can turn authentication over to a third party. And we've all, I'm sure, been to a site now which said, log in with my Facebook identification. And you've logged in with your Facebook identification. You can do that also. Now you have to, talk to Facebook and set up a relationship with them and give them some money. But so that's all under the heading of external authentication. If you don't want to use your contact table as a list of users with passwords, then you can certainly create some relationship with your own copy of Azure Active Directory or with a third party. So these are your authentication option screens that you can pick. And as you can see, there's local sign-in, contact, there's your Azure Active Directory, there's the Azure Active Directory B2C, and then the various other third-party providers that you might want to do business with. Certainly the easiest one to set up is Azure Active Directory, but you probably don't want to put non-staff members in your Azure Active Directory. The next easiest is local sign-in, and everything else is about the same amount of work, because with everything else, you're establishing a trust relationship of some kind. Now, authorization. And we have some special authorization options in this in Azure Portal that we haven't seen before. And that's the stuff you see here under Share with External Users. And you have all the stuff we've seen before with security roles and all the things we've talked about. But with these external users, the users who aren't in your Azure Active Directory, so these are the users who are in your contacts table, for example. What you do with them is you set up, and I don't know if you can read that on the screen, it says web roles. And so what you can do is establish web roles, which is a whole separate security system from what we've seen in Azure Active Directory. You can set up web roles, and then as users show up in the contacts list, you can assign them a web role. You can also invite users. You can set the users up in your contact list and then send them an invitation with a link. And of course, when you set them up in your contact list, you can assign them to a web role at that point. So what does a web role consist of? First off, it consists of, are they allowed to access the website at all? And they refer to those as the website permissions. So are they allowed to access the website at all? Then for any particular web page, are they allowed to access that particular web page? And then for any particular table, and this begins to sound a little bit familiar, for any particular table, are they allowed to do read, write, update, delete? Now that read, write, update, delete, you can specify that at the website permission level also. In addition to, are they allowed to access the website, you can say, well, they are allowed to access the website, but they're only allowed to read. So you can make them read-only users for your whole site. And then on the web page level, you can perhaps give them some more flexibility. You can say, okay, well, you can read everything on the site. On this particular page, the send me information about your products page, we will let you add new rows to that. We will let you add new rows to that list of potential leads. So what front-side editing permissions a particular role should have, including are they allowed to get on page, what pages can they get to, and then what actions can you take? We've seen actions before. Remember all this stuff here. Those are what, and that's, is the user allowed to click the edit button, the delete button, the create button, and so on. Oh, heck. Don't go away. I hit the end key and I've gone right to the end of the slides. You know, if I was a sensible person, I'd break the slides up by chapters so that I couldn't ever go right to the end of the whole course. I could only go to the end of a chapter. Yep. And then table permissions, what table, on a table by table basis, what is the user allowed to do? So the idea here is that you've got, in terms of Dynamics 365, but this applies to anything, is that you want to create a app that handles product warranties, so users may want to be able to access that information. Return management authorization, so the users want to be able to return products. And the idea is by building a self-serve portal, customers will no longer have to call somebody in your organization, and instead customers can do it themselves. Very much like what, you probably by this time in your life you've returned something from Amazon, and you never interact with a person when you do that. So as I say, you can add table forms or table lists. You add a table list if you want your page to display multiple items. And here we are with a list. There's someone's grabbed a list there, and they're going to drag it onto the screen. And now we have a screen that displays a list. Now, this is, remember I've been talking about this brand new language that Microsoft has invented for generating HTML at runtime. And the way, and this is if you want to customize your templates, if you want to create a template from scratch, you use the liquid language to define your template. A liquid command begins with a curly brace, ends with a curly brace, actually begins curly brace %, ends %, curly brace. And then here the first thing you have is the keyword for what action is this liquid tag performing. The include tag allows you to go and get some component and add it to the page. Then you specify the kind of component you're adding, and then you can use the key parameter to specify the name of the component that you're adding. So when you are working with the App Portal Studio and you pick a list and add it to the page, if you were going to look at the source code for your page, let's see, that's donation, what you would find would be that it would add a liquid tag with the name of the list in it, which is donation or donations. And of course, if you get comfortable enough with liquid, you don't need that graphical interface. You can just open up a blank page and start typing in these commands yourself. So, and then you can configure, again, if you click on that table list, you'll get a property window down the right-hand side, and you can start setting the properties, configuring the way you want it to look. Now, let us say that, as we saw with our, when we went and got the contact list, when we went and looked at the contact list, when we first, contact table, when we added it, there were a bunch of forms, and there were a bunch of views. And I think we picked one form and one view and added them to our permit. Well, if you add a table list, then you give the user the ability to pick whatever view they want. The table list will have a drop-down in the upper left-hand corner that will list off every view. And remember, when we created any of our tables, when we went and looked at the subcomponents, the part of creating that table, they generated a bunch of views for us. So your user will get to pick any one of those views. When you add a table list to a web page, every column is automatically enabled for sorting purposes. One of the things you can configure is how many items on a page, so you can manage pagination. I think you can also configure what the next and previous and whether or not you want to go to first and the go to last view. And you can also configure how each individual item is displayed in the page. So you might want to say, oh, well, I want this column, I want it actually to be a hyperlink rather than the actual data, in addition to showing the actual data. Your list will also get a search option, so the user can narrow the list down to just the one that they want. And you can, if you've got the data organized you see over here, you'll notice this has got several different companies are displayed in this list. You can also give the user a filter on a column by column basis. So, and on a site level. Remember, we talked about currency, that if you add a currency column to a table, it will automatically give the user a drop-down list of all of the currencies that your site is configured for. So this allows the user, for example, if your table has a currency column, to say, okay, I want this row to be handled using one of the currencies and you get an option set that's automatically loaded with all the currencies for your that you've configured your site for. Well, this currency you can choose to have, if you've configured currencies, you can choose to have that on the site too. And these are, if the user has an email associated with them, you can add that. Again, working with the contact list, that would be an option that's available to you. When it goes to display the data, you've got a variety of different choices for how the data is to be displayed. If we've talked about the list, the user gets to pick which view they want to use to see the list in. But if you add a form, you can choose how the form is to be displayed. And again, going back to Monday, remember we talked about how you might want to set up a table and identify this table as an activity table. Activity tables are tables that store information that is time-based. Well, one of the benefits of setting up an activity table is that you get the option to display it as a calendar format in a web app portal. If there are columns in there that show geographical data, then you can display it as a map, and it will put, it'll highlight the records on the map, assuming you've got columns with, latitude and longitude or some GPS kind of information. I'm going to come back and talk about OData in a couple more slides, so I'm not ignoring that. We are going to talk about that. When you check off those actions, where do they appear? There's a create button, there's a download button. If you checked off those two actions, in a form, all the actions appear as buttons. In a grid, in a list, most of the actions appear in a drop-down list on a record-by-record basis, so that you can choose to view the detail for one row, and then choose to pick. You might pick delete to delete another row. So, but again, one of the things I'm sort of trying to point out here is you don't have it's back to being that model-driven application. You don't have a lot of control over the layout. You get to pick what functionality is on the page. At least at this point, you don't have a lot of control over the layout. You get to pick what functionality is on the page, but the layout is going to be controlled primarily by the template that you've picked. So you can use table forms to interact with data-first data, and this is a form that's coming up, and the user has been restricted to adding new. This is update item, and you notice there's a submit button down there for the user to save what they're doing. And if there being additional options, I'm pretty sure all the buttons for any additional options like download or create would appear up here. Notice you get, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. Back off. So again, it's your model-driven forms that you've chosen to add to this page that acts as the template, that controls the way the page is displayed. It's not going to look exactly the way it does in your model-driven app, but it's going to look very similar. When you go to create the form, as I said, there's all these checkoff options. One of the checkoff options is, do you want to put a CAPTCHA on the form? So again, notice it's not so much a matter of building a page, but picking the template, picking a form, picking a view, and then checking off the options you want to have put on the page. It means you may not get something that looks exactly the way you want, but it means you can generate a website really quickly, right? Because you're not handcrafting every option. So table forms can be used to control layout in a read-only mode. You can use forms to capture information, put them on the screen, specify that for this user, this screen is add only. Record management, so in that case you can specify that this table form can be used for add, update, and delete. And of course, if you combine them with table lists and subgrids, and you can put JavaScript on here, we're not going to talk about that, don't panic, then the user gets that hierarchy of websites where they get a list and they pick the list, and you've checked off the detail option for this page. So when the user clicks on the item on the list, they are taken to the form that displays that particular item. So here is a table form, and the user, the developer here has picked the table, and now they're going to pick the form that will go on to this particular page. Now, that sort of raises an interesting question. So the user clicks on the gets the list, and they click they click an item, and they're taken to a page that displays just that item, just the detail for that item. How does the page know what to display? And the default way is the one I mentioned before, is a query string. And that's the one you're going to use 99% of the time, that you just, at the end of the URL that takes you to the page, you go question mark, then whatever is the field that holds the unique identifier, maybe you've left it at the default of name, and then you put in whatever value. Now, I want to point out something. You'll know the URL for every page. It's included in the properties when you're working on the page, and of course when you bring the site up, it's right there in the address bar. So this means that on other sites, on other pages, you can create anchor tags that take you to your web portal page. You put in the URL for your page, and then you go in the query string and you put in, well, what data do I want to display? So I want to emphasize that the web portal doesn't have to be sort of a separate world of its own. Because the URLs are pretty easy to, and because there's convention around the URLs, it's pretty easy to create links between your other website pages and your web portal page. The other option, again, when you create your page, you can mark it as the form mode. And so there's our form mode, read only, insert, or edit. You can mark it as not using query string, but using current portal user. And that, when the user goes to that page, what they see is their profile page. Now, if you are setting up users in a B2B, business-to-business environment, all of the users you set up in that environment, so all the users you set up in that environment, are recorded as belonging to some parent organization. And there is a web page generated for each of these users, each of the information from their entry in Azure Active Directory. And as part of, setting up a business-to-business relationship, you also set up the parent organization these people belong to. There's also a page created for the parent account details. And you can, if you specify a page as record associated to current portal user, then when the user goes to that page, if there is a parent record, it will be displayed to them, and then you can decide whether or not, using those web roles before, if they're allowed to just look at that information or allowed to update that information. My guess is you would probably want to designate one of those users from the other company as being able to update this. Why would you be maintaining the information about this other company? It seems to me that those business partners, people who work for that business partner, is the best person to maintain that information. Additional configuration options allow you to control, for example, if it's an update or a read or an edit form. What happens when the user clicks that submit button that we saw? And your three choices are show a success message, redirect the user to another page, which probably says, congratulations, you saved your data, or return to the list page. So if the user picks details and they arrive on this page and they're allowed to edit this page, the user makes their changes, they click the submit button, and either they stay on the page and they get congratulations, your changes have been saved, they're sent to some completely different page, perhaps the next step in the typical process, or they go back to the list. It's a drop-down choice. Again, you're not writing the code, you're just saying what you want. If you pick success message, it displays that you gets to put in the message you want displayed. If you picked redirect, you would put in the URL of the page you want to send them to. There's that show CAPTCHA option. This is show CAPTCHA even if the user is authenticated. CAPTCHA by default is only shown if the user hasn't provided a username and password. Hide form on success, then the form would disappear and the user would only see that. For the other ones where they go to another form, who cares whether or not you hide the form on success? But if you're displaying the success message, you may want to display the success message in a blank screen. There are a ton of options you can set. I'm not sure which ones they want me to mention on this page. So what are some of the settings you can set? What are some of the options that you can set for any particular entity form? So we've looked at some of the configuration options. We've looked at the actions. There's another section called metadata, and this allows you to specify, create a tab for, and put some attribute here, means columns. Create a tab, put some of the columns on this tab, put some of the columns on another tab. This allows you to control how a subgrid on the page is to be displayed. This allows you to put in any notes to keep track of what you've done. And this gives you a history of what's happened to that page over time. Now, this really is, even more so than we've talked before, this really is a web page. And when you pick those presets or themes, whatever you want to call them, you're really picking cascading style sheets. And when you see the page, you'll see a link tag, and it's bringing in a cascading style sheet. So to control the appearance, you're free to go in and modify those cascading style sheets. Again, I would suggest make a copy and modify the copy and keep the original around. I always worry that if I modify the original and then there's some upgrade or some set of enhancements, they're going to enhance all the original ones and all the original cascading style sheets and wipe out all my changes. So just to protect myself from that, I always make a copy and use the copy and modify the copy. Having said all of that, they're not actually using cascading style sheets directly. They're using something called Bootstrap. And Bootstrap lets you do wonderful things with layout and appearance of your page without actually having to know cascading style sheets. And Bootstrap is a combination of cascading style sheets and JavaScript files. And you configure your page by putting class attributes on your elements to pick up your cascading style sheet classes, but also by putting attributes on your elements that attract, I guess one way to put it, attract certain Bootstrap behaviors. So for instance, it's really easy to set up a 2-column layout in Bootstrap. You put in 2 div elements, you specify that you want a 2-column layout, and this is the column on the left and this is the column on the right. And then you specify how much of the page, in Bootstrap, it divides the page up into a grid. You specify how many columns you want each of your columns to take up, and you're done. It'll work it out. It'll make it work for you. So there's additional settings. Again, I'm not sure what they want you to specify under there. There's a lot of stuff. You can look at it. Associate current portal user on insert. What this does is when the user adds a new row, they are marked as the owner of that row. And as a result, when you're setting up permissions, you can say, well, you're allowed to change records you've created. So you're allowed to go and change your sales order, but you're not allowed to change anybody else's sales order. Of course, you probably won't even let them view other people's sales orders. But that's a different issue. So you can associate the current portal user, but you can also, if you wish, set up so when the record is added, it is added as if it were added by somebody else. I mentioned this briefly before, that you can, if you want to kick off a Power Automate process, for instance, and have it do things the currently logged in user isn't allowed to do, you can say that you can delegate another user to execute as if it were being called by another user. This is called on behalf of. And you'll find, for instance, if you go and look at the columns for a table, you'll find that the columns for the table, they have an owner, they have a created by, and they have a created on behalf of. And I guess I think I got it. Modified by. Let's use modified by. And they've got created by too. On behalf of, and then as I say, I should have put in new stuff and then created. This will always be the real person who did it. This will always be the real person who did it. If you want to track back to the person whose hands were on the keyboard, the person who was logged in, then that will be in the modified on behalf of, or the created on behalf of. The other ones will reflect who it was delegated to. So you can let the user do things that they would not otherwise be allowed to do. You can specify that there's to be a file upload control on the page, and the user, if they're looking at a form, can upload a file. And provided you've set up that table to accept attachments, they can upload and attach. And you can turn on geolocation, important part. And now when the user brings up the map, their current location will be displayed on the map. So geolocation means that when a map is displayed, if a map, remember that was one of our options, if a map is displayed, the user's current position will be marked on the map. You can also create table references, so you can associate the current record with another record. So our permit would be associated with inspections, for instance. And this would support displaying those quick forms. So if the user is looking at a permit, they could pick an inspection, or let's make a simpler example. Users looking at inspection, they can bring up a quick form that shows them the permit that inspection is associated with. We've already talked about all these actions. We've talked about the table form metadata. This allows you to control the appearance of the columns. And if you've divided your page up into sections of individual sections, we've already created tabs. You can control the appearance of tabs. And again, we've seen much of this. So I am not clear on how this is different from the previous page that we saw about putting a table form, except down here, this is the liquid that is added when you add a table form. What we saw before was adding a table list, and we used include, table list, and then the name of the table list. To add a form tied to a table, we go entity form, and then we use the name parameter, and we would put in the name of our table. So if you were to look at the source code generated by putting a form on the page, you would find in here, you would find perhaps permit. Yep. So you can do a lot of stuff just by pointing, clicking, dragging, picking options, and you can generate a pretty effective website in not a lot of time. And you think back to Tuesday and creating your model-driven application. You'd have quite a lot of functionality in the space of about less than an hour. However, if you're not happy with that, then you can go in and start writing your own liquid commands. You can start fiddling with the cascading style sheets. You can, and the liquid commands generate most of your HTML. You can certainly hard code HTML in there. And then you can start adding JavaScript. There's a bunch of stuff that you don't get with web portals. You can't use your JavaScript web resources. If you want to use JavaScript in your web page, you have to put in a script tag and pull your script file down from some website that you've kept it on, or put in a script tag and just put your JavaScript code into that script tag. But you can't use the JavaScript files you've uploaded as web resources. It doesn't support client-side business rules. Now, don't go, oh my gosh, well, I've been thinking about using business rules and using them to control, and Peter said it doesn't matter where you access the table from, the business rule always applies. The key phrase there is client-side. When the user clicks the submit button and the data is sent back to the data server, sent back to the Dataverse, the business rules will be applied, and if there's a problem, it'll come back and say, I'm sorry, we're not going to let you save this record because of this reason. However, it doesn't apply client-side business rules. So all the stuff that we talked about you being able to do in a business rule, clear a field, fill in a field with another value, change an optional field to required or required to optional, enable or disable, you can't do any of those things. But if you have a business rule that checks the data and generates an error message if you fail, that will still work. It's just the user won't find out until they click the submit button. So table scope business rules still apply because they're implemented on the servers. Just the client-side updates don't work. You can still run Power Automate flows. That works just fine. Not clear what they're doing when they distinguish between workflows and Power Automate flows, because now they're the same thing. Because again, that's running on the server. So you can have a button trigger a Power Automate flow. Basically, as they say here, all the server-side code runs as usual. So, and all your plugins, right? The plugins that run in the Dataverse, like those work also. Assuming the Dataverse will talk to your registration tool. If you are creating web pages, you should think about your development life cycle and going through testing and quality approval and how you're going to roll this out to production. If these portals become important to your organization, then people are going to take an interest and want to know that they can count on a process that delivers enhancements that's reliable. Portal meta. Now, you notice we haven't talked at all about solutions or environments or any of that. And there's a reason for that. This is entirely independent of solutions and environments. You do all of this in the portal management web page. And as they say here, all these configuration choices you've been making, they're stored in 4 or 5 dozen different tables. And that's true of everything else we've done. It's all stored in tables in the Dataverse. The problem is, if you look up here on the ribbon, you'll notice a complete absence of publish all customizations. It's a different process you use for sharing, distributing, deploying your web app portals. And what you use is this tool called CRM configuration migration. And what it was originally designed to do was to let you take tables out of the Dataverse and put them in a zip file and then import them into some other Dataverse or some other environment. with Web Portal, what it does is you pick this export data option, and what it does is it exports your tables into a zip file, which you download to your computer, and it knows what the tables are and will create all the tables, and it will take care of it for you. And then when you want to add this to some other site, you start up the CRM configuration migration tool, and you pick import data, and that will load your configuration information into another web portal management. But the stuff that we're used to in these other, no, that just doesn't exist. So, as I said, you can certainly add JavaScript to your pages, and if you want to add JavaScript to your pages, good news. If you're familiar with jQuery, you can use jQuery. Do recognize, however, if you are using Liquid to generate your HTML, that that HTML might change and your jQuery will stop working. I don't know if you can read it, but this particular one is using include, and then it's provided the name of a code of a snippet there, and that snippet is called layout one column. And if your jQuery is working with that snippet, might contain text, might contain HTML. If your jQuery is working with HTML in that layout one column snippet, and somebody goes and changes that HTML, you are going to be disappointed. Your jQuery might not work anymore. So, but you can just create you can create your JavaScript files and add them to your pages. That's actually sort of a poor example, because this is just this code snippet. You notice we're in the code editor. This code snippet is actually, I assume, bringing in another JavaScript file. This is not creating a web page. It's creating a JavaScript file. Never mind. Oh, no, I'm being wrong. I'm stupid. Pretend I didn't say that. Yeah, this is creating a page. It's just opened the code editor. Sorry, there is a code editor built into the page. And so this is, in fact, HTML. And then this is the code editor that allows you to add script to your page. So what might you write? You might use the jQuery ready function to check to see if the page is fully loaded. You might look for an element whose ID attribute is set to subject, and then set its value attribute to submitted from contact us form. You might then find that element again whose ID attribute is set to subject. Look for the closest TR tag. So this suggests that whatever this element is, whose ID property is set to subject, it's sitting inside a table row. So closest TR will find the table row that this element is inside of, and then we're going to call the hide property. So that table row would disappear from the screen. So I assume this element that's inside the table row would also disappear from the screen. And that's perfectly good jQuery. If you have some experience with jQuery, oh yeah, I've seen this before, and I've done this before. Here it is down there. Now these days in jQuery, you wouldn't write it like that. You'd write it like that. You just go $ open parenthesis, and then you'd put the function in there. You wouldn't spell out $document.ready. So that may be more from that's if you know jQuery, that's probably the way you're used to seeing it. It's just $ open paren, and then the function you want to run when the page is ready to display. As you're adding cascading style sheets, you're free to do anything you want. If you've looked at, do remember, however, that if you're wrong talk. Since it is using Bootstrap to handle the layout for everything, some familiarity with Bootstrap is a good idea. For instance, this is a Bootstrap cascading style sheet rule. And you're to use it when you're setting up a navigation system, and it ensures that your navigation bar pins itself to the top of the page. And then as the user scrolls, the navigation bar stays there, and the page scrolls underneath the navigation bar. And inside the navigation inside the navigation bar as a whole, we have a nav bar, and you're setting it to be at least 100 pixels high. So this means as the screen is made smaller, and one of the things that happens as your screen is made smaller is everything on the screen is made smaller. This will say, no, the navigation cannot get less than 100 pixels high. So, and if you're wondering where this came from, that's because this layout is all handled, as I said, with Bootstrap. By the way, neat feature of the Bootstrap navigation system. As you shrink down the size of your page, let's say you've got a navigation menu with 4 items on it. As you make your page narrower, Bootstrap automatically converts that into a hamburger menu. And when the user clicks on the hamburger menu, there are the 4 choices that were laid out when the screen was wide enough. Big fan of Bootstrap. So portals use the Bootstrap front-end framework to control the design. That's where that tag comes. By the way, Bootstrap's tremendously popular. Everybody uses it. And many people use it without changing a thing. And the result is that there's an enormous number of websites that have been training your users to recognize Bootstrap user interface components. Bootstrap, for instance, allows you to distinguish between primary and secondary buttons, the important button on the page and the other buttons on the page. And the result is we've all been subconsciously trained to recognize the primary button on the page because it's usually formatted using unchanged Bootstrap. And we automatically know these buttons are secondary because they've been formatted with the Bootstrap secondary. There's a lot to be said for using Bootstrap. The fact that it's so popular, all these other sites have been training your users to recognize the Bootstrap conventions. Now, one of the things you could do is you can create your own CSS files. There's an option in the PowerApps portal site for you to upload custom CSS, and then you can use link tags in your pages to drag it in. Notice by default, the Bootstrap minimized file, the Bootstrap file made as small as possible to download as fast as possible, has already been loaded for you. So it's there. I think you should take advantage of it. Now, a lot of people, when they start using Bootstrap, they go, I like the functionality, but at our company, we have our own color scheme, we have our own logo, and there's, on the Bootstrap site, there is a tool called Theme Roller that allows you to generate a custom set of Bootstrap files, but you get to pick the colors that are used, also the font that's used, the font sizes used in headings, and so on. And it's pretty good. So you can have your own custom version of Bootstrap, changing the appearance kinds of, the look and feel kinds of things. But the overall structure and the overall functionality, you still get all of that. Some people do. I've never had a problem with the Bootstrap theme roller. I'm told that there are better Bootstrap theme rollers out there. You might want to do a search and look at reviews. And when you go, if you decide to roll your own Bootstrap theme, you might want to use one of those theme rollers. So you can use web file records to control on a page-by-page basis which cascading style sheets are used with which particular pages, if you don't want to do it just on a whole site basis. If you want to have special cascading style sheets, for example, for special pages, just strikes me as a nightmare, but feel free. And as I say, you can customize the fonts, and background images is something else you get to pick when you do the theme roller. And here's an example of CSS in action that you want to modify it so that when the CSS class, you're going to make several things disappear at once. And you want to make sure that when the user clicks a button that hides one thing, you hide a whole bunch of stuff. There, as you get farther along, Microsoft, there are people who've created add-on libraries for a web portal, but I mean, it's just JavaScript and HTML, really, and it's Bootstrap, for heaven's sake. So as a result, you can tap into this enormous market of stuff that people have made available for building websites. You can issue API calls, and we're going to talk about calling the the Dataverse API. And there's nothing stopping you from creating a companion application that links to the to your web portal, or the web portal links to the application. It says add client-side functionality. I have no idea. There's no lab here, folks. There was, but there isn't anymore. So let us say that you go, I'm not really happy with what I've got here. I want to be able to tweak it. So what I would suggest you do is initially, at any rate, use the web portals stuff that we've been talking about, add forms, add lists, check off the functionality you want, and then open it in the source code editor and start tweaking with the Liquid commands that is actually driving all this. So that requires some knowledge of Liquid. And all I want to do is give you some idea of the feel of what Liquid does. So let us say that we've created a file called twig. And here's some hard-coded HTML. And this is including a code snippet called breadcrumbs. And this is including a code snippet called page header, code snippet called page copy. And notice you can put in if statements so that this will only be included if this variable and page allows you to set up variables at the page level if this variable is set to true. But the key thing I want to point out here is this Liquid command, block. What this is doing is assigning the name main to everything from the block down to end block. And you don't have to indent it. If that something went wrong with the layout here when they printed this slide. So everything in here is in a block called main. Now the reason that's interesting is I could include twig in another page. So I could go curly brace, percentage, include twig, and then if I wanted to, I could refer to the main block, the block main, and I could replace it with something else, or I could customize it with something else. Now, I don't think this is a great example because there's so much in here in main. Typically inside a block you put very little stuff so the user can selectively customize just parts of it. But notice what we've got here. If I choose not to do that, this is the default content on the page. However, if I like this, I can reuse twig on another page by including it, referencing the block that's being set up here called main, and then putting in different stuff in there. And one of the things, if you do get into Liquid and using Liquid, you should always be looking at the stuff you're creating, going, well, if somebody wanted to reuse this, what would they want to be able to change? What would they want to be able? I may want to provide some default content, but what would I want to be able to tweak? And put that inside a block. If a developer uses your code snippet, uses your stuff as a code snippet, decides not to change it, they don't have to. They'll get your default content, but then they can also change it. You get a free default header and footer, but you can choose to override those. You can override the global header and footer if you want to. Your web template, when you save it, you give it a name. You specify the content of that, which is static text, HTML, Liquid, and then you also specify the MIME type that will be sent to the user. Now, normally what you're going to send to the user is text/HTML. So if you've been playing along with this and you're creating, templates and code snippets that you then use to create templates, you're going to label all of them as text HTML. But if you want, you can turn off the header and the footer and specify the return type as application JSON. If you tie this to a table, then if someone uses the URL, and remember, you know the URL, and you can go slash, and then put in the name column equals and the value you want to retrieve. If you turn off the header and footer and specify the MIME type for this as application JSON, then when web portal goes to build this page, it will grab the data from whatever data you specify to retrieve and convert it into a JSON format and send it down to the client. So you've effectively created a URL that returns JSON, and the user tweaks the URL just in the query string to specify which data they want. You have a web service. As far as the web portal is concerned, it's just another web page. So all those permissions that you set up earlier on still apply. What if, okay, so that's how you can, what if you wanted in your page to call a web service? If you wanted to call a web service, Microsoft has this language called Fetch XML, and Liquid understands Fetch XML. And in Fetch XML, it's set up to work with the Dataverse. You put in an element that references a table. You put in one or more attribute names that reference the columns you want. And when this page goes to be processed, when it sees the Liquid Fetch XML, it will run. It will issue a query that pulls back, in this case, the name column from the account table, and it will stuff it into this variable up here, var results. Then farther down in your page, you can now loop through. Now the data that's retrieved is put into an object called results. So there's that var results variable, but it's put into an object called results in that variable, and it has a, well, in this case, because there's only one column, it'll have a one-column table in it with all of the names. And so on. And so now you can loop through this, and this item here assigns a name to each row. So each, and first time through, account is going to be pointing at that row. Second time through, account is going to be pointing at this row. And then you can access the individual properties in the row. So this is a one-column table with the column called name. If you're used to writing C#, I don't know about any other language. If you're used to writing C#, you're going to go, I've seen this. Actually, if you're used to writing, no, I get it. If you're used to writing C#, you've seen this before. The only thing that's tricky here is if I wrote it like that, what would appear on the screen would be ACCOUNT.NAME over and over again. What I wanted to do is extract the value of the name column. And I do that by putting these double handlebars, double French braces, double mustaches, whatever you want to call them. And that tells Liquid, don't put the letters ACCOUNT. Instead, treat that as an expression and evaluate it and put the value of that expression on the screen. You can put comments in. Comments are ignored. So as a result, what will appear on the screen is this is a comment. And this will not appear on the screen because it's inside the Liquid comment tag. Here we are including a item called breadcrumbs, and this is going to find a block. It assumes there's a block inside breadcrumbs called separator, and it's going to replace separator with greater than sign. So whoever created this code snippet called breadcrumbs, they went percentage block separator and block think it's actually all lowercase, isn't it? I shouldn't be doing uppercasing. And they probably put in maybe a colon in there. So this allows you to replace the contents of a block when you use a code snippet. So you can define a block within a template, and that's a region that can be changed. You should always provide a default content, so the person doesn't have to provide the value if they don't want to. So here is an example of someone using, setting up a block called content, not perhaps the best name in the world, and providing useless default content that provided the words default content as the default content. So we have a block here called content, and here is somebody using that block and overriding the content. Notice this thing was called content, overriding the block called content with what's in here. So you notice you have two ways of specifying the content you want to use to override. You can use this syntax in a single liquid statement, and you can go colon, and that's the value you want to replace the separator content. Or you can use this syntax with two liquid. Oops, wrong slide. With an open and close liquid. Open and close liquid, and then the content you want to use to replace it here in the middle. Now, if you want to do this, if you want to override the block content, then you have to put in, before you try to do that, you have to put in $extends and then the name of the template. And this fetches the template, and then this allows you to override particular blocks within it. So this PowerApp's portal is going to replace the default content. We're still going to get the div element. We're still going to get the word hello and the close div tag. So we get div hello, and now we get PowerApp's portals in there. Give things descriptive names. Use the include tag to build up your templates from smaller templates. As you're building templates and snippets, recognize, I say, where users are going to want to replace the content with their own stuff. Try to distinguish between templates that are there for page layout and content, and allow the users to integrate their content into your layout. Generally speaking, if you have your JavaScript, don't put it in the page. Put in a script tag, sure, but have your script tag refer to a file and keep your JavaScript in a file somewhere else. Always be looking for stuff that you can turn into templates. And one of the things you should be looking for is where you're going to have to replace content on the basis for internationalization, and support that in your templates. Provide lots of layout. I have no idea what this means. Avoid excessive blank lines by using hyphens in your tags. That's quoted word for word. I checked. It's quoted word for word out of the textbook. I went and did some research. The only thing I can think of is by using hyphens in here, it ensures that if this isn't printed, there will be no blanks, that whatever's below here will be collapsed upward to whatever is above it. And if you didn't put in those hyphens, then you would simply end up with a big blank area in here. But that requires more knowledge of Liquid than I have. So, Microsoft has a Center of Excellence page for working with Liquid, and talks about the kinds of things you can do. And notice use the and they forgot to put in the name of the tag to describe complex parts of the template. I think they meant to put in comments. I think that's what they meant to put in there. Use the comments tag to describe complex. But it thought it was a comments tag, so it didn't print it. Here is the page template table. As I said, there's all these headings you can set, and I've mentioned several times you can turn off the header and footer, and that's where you turn off the header and footer. If you want to provide your own header and footer on a page-by-page basis, or you've built the header and footer into the template that all your other pages are variations on, or if you want to create your own web service using API portal. So here is an example of an API portal. They're using entity view. This is a way instead of using a form list, we're going to go and get all the information for an entity. This is the entity we're going to retrieve. That's what it's called. There we are looping through all the records in the entity view and building a JSON output. And by golly, we've created a web service. You know, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. So, all right, last chapter, integrating the Power Platform and the Dataverse. And you've actually done some of this. If you were able to get the component exercise, if you're able to get the client-side scripting exercise to work for you, one of the pieces of code you inserted uses the XRM global variable to go and retrieve a table from the Dataverse. And it's real easy with XRM. It's just method call, put in the table name, put in the column names you want. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then we're going to talk about the things you can do in Azure. So if you call the web service, you can issue a REST query, which means you use standard HTML format calls. There's a ton of tools in JavaScript. We've got the fetch built into JavaScript that you can use for calling fetch API. We've got, if we're using jQuery, we've got the Ajax tool that's built into jQuery. If you're working with C#, if you're working with .NET programs, you've got the HTTP client. Every platform has tools for issuing HTTP requests against web services. And a web service that accepts a standard HTTP request is referred to as a RESTful web service. And we've looked at fetch XML just now, which we can use in Liquid. What's new on this page is OData 4.0. OData allows you in a query string to specify what rows and what columns for those rows you want out of the table. So it's effectively a way of sort of issuing SQL queries against a table using a web service. So we're going to look at a little bit of some of the things you can do with an OData query. However, we do need to talk a little bit about authentication. And that is, you can't just have random people building web clients that are calling these web services. So Microsoft uses, and this is an industry standard, OAuth 2 to validate any web service call. Now, when you issue a web service call, it begins with an HTTP verb like get, which is supposed to call the web service to return data, so it's read. Post, which is supposed to cause the web service to add data, so that's a create. Delete, which is supposed to call, and this is a convention everybody follows. The request begins with delete. It's supposed to, delete the data. And then we get to do updates. If you are doing an update of an existing record, you use put. And the web service is supposed to take your data and do an update. However, the system also supports the HTTP verb patch, which is an upsert. And what patch does is it allows you to do an insert and specify the primary key. Like normally when we do an insert, when we create a new record, the database generates the primary key that uniquely identifies this row. So when we do a post, we send all the data to go into the database except the primary key. The database is going to generate the primary key, going to generate the customer ID for us. You use patch if you want to send the data and you want to include the primary key. But for some reason, you get to specify the primary key value. And what will happen is, on a patch, the system will look to see if there is a row with that primary key already. And if there isn't, it will add the record with the primary key you provided. And if there is a row that already has that primary key, then it will update that row with the data you provided, which is why this is called an upsert. It does an insert if there's no entry for that, and it does an update if there is an entry for that. So your request begins with one of those 5 verbs, and then the URL that you're issuing the request against. And then what follows is what are referred to as the HTTP headers. And one of the things you can put in this HTTP headers are a set of tokens. Tokens are just encrypted strings. And what will happen, what OAuth 2 does is it looks for you to have certain headers, specific headers with specific names, and then what it expects to extract out of those headers are tokens, which it can then decrypt. And if it can successfully decrypt the token, that indicates you are okay. But you could only have a token that your site could successfully decrypt if you had been authorized. So the goal here is to get the tokens and then include them in your requests so that you will be allowed to do what you want to do. So the way you get the tokens is through the authentication process. You send some credential information to Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory, if your credentials are okay, will send you back the tokens that you need to include in the headers of your request. And that's the authorization process that goes on from there. So if you want to be able to if you want to write a program, including web portals, if you want to write a program that's going to call your Dataverse, call the API in the Dataverse, you have to register your application with Azure Active Directory. This is what we do as people, right? As human beings, if we want to interact with Azure, we have to be set up in Azure first. We have to register with the website. If we have an application that wants to call our web services, then we have to register our application. And that will give us an application client ID. And that's what we put into our initial request. The fact that our request has this application ID indicates that we are authenticated. Now when our web service calls the Dataverse will look for a header that contains that application client ID. Header's got a specific name. It'll take the application client ID. It'll go to this list of registered, and it'll go, oh yeah, this person's okay. They're all right. And then it will send you back the tokens that are used for authentication. And those tokens need to be included in all of your subsequent requests. So one of the things you do when you set up your application is you also typically have to specify a return API. And when your request goes in, the tokens are generated, and then the tokens are sent back to that return API, and that's where you do your actual work. Excuse me. So if we register an application, we say, who can use this application? And we say only accounts set up in our Azure Active Directory. If we are an organization that perhaps we bought several other companies, and so they've all got their own Azure Active Directories, then we can say accounts, we can pick any organizational directory, or we can say, okay, any organizational directory or a personal Microsoft account. So this is all Active Directory oriented. So if you've set up a personal account with, for instance, Microsoft 365, and I have both an Azure account and a Microsoft 365 account, I would love to merge them, but I've never taken the time. Or if you've got Xbox, or if you've got Skype, you have, and you're just deciding here how many people get to call this API. And then you have to specify the redirect URL, and that's where the tokens will be sent back to. So your access is controlled by two things. Who is the user running this, and what application ID? Is this, in fact, a registered application? And the goal is to make sure that what we authorize to do is not something that the user is not allowed to do. The user cannot get the web service to do something that the user would not be allowed to do. So, again, when you create your application and you register it, it's going to generate a manifest that holds a whole bunch of information about your application. I'm not going to drag you through all that. This is generated for you by the registration process. Then you're going to set up what you're going to take those applications. You're going to set up who's allowed to do what in these applications. So just because you set up an application doesn't mean it can access anything in the Dataverse. Once you set up the application, you then go in and you specify what permissions. Just like with the user, right? You'd say, well, this user is allowed to do these things. You come here and you say, well, this application is allowed to do these things. So you get to select permissions, and you also get to specify user impersonation. And this allows, if you want, users to do things through the web service they would not be allowed to do on their own. You say, okay, well, we're going to have you pretend to be some other user while you're running this application, and that other user is allowed to do typically more things than you would be allowed to do. So, if you want, I mentioned Postman before. Postman's a desktop utility that you can download and run, and it allows you to try out web service calls. It also will generate a description of your web service. We talked about it before, as using that description to build your application. But if you want to try this out, you can get those various tokens, and you can slap them into a Postman request and see what you get. So when your programs aren't working, this is a way to see if the problem is with your API request. Maybe you're getting back something different than you were expecting. So here is a typical request. This is a post. So as I say, it begins with the HTTP verb. So this is going to attempt to add a record. It's asking the web service to add a record. There's the URL. This part, of course, would be your actual organization, HTTP : probably HTTPS : / your actual URL for your site. Right at the end, the version of HTTP we're using. Apparently, they're rolling out HTTP 3. HTTP 2 is fabulous, but it's not widely adopted. And a lot of Azure doesn't support HTTP 2, and people are now pushing for HTTP 3. Anyway, you then specify what kind of data you're sending. In our case, we're always sending JSON. And if you look down here, you can see that is plainly a JSON document. You specify what version of OData you're using and the maximum version you're compatible with. And then you say what data you want to get back, and we want to get our data back as application JSON. Now, some sites, when you send off a post request, it adds your record, and it sends back just a response with a status code saying your record was added. And when someone's adding a record, the status code that should come back is 203 for created. For a read request, then when they send back the result, then you will have application data in the result you get back. So it's more important to specify on a GET request, which is when you're asking for data. It's more important there to specify how you want the data to come back. But as I say, a lot of post systems, they're not going to send you anything back other than the status code. The status code on a read request should be 200 if everything worked. So here is a GET request, and there is the URL. And this is the simplest way to ask for a record from the accounts table, where the account has, this is the primary key value for the account. God willing, your primary keys don't look like that, eh? So this would be the URL for your Dataverse, and then API data, the version of the API you're running against, then the table name, and then a key. And that's great if all you want to do is retrieve a single row. And notice with a GET, everything you need to do in a GET, in a read request, is in the URL. So a GET request doesn't have anything down here, so you don't have to specify the content type because there's no body. Everything you need to do the request is in the URL. So this is a patch request, and there is the URL. By the way, the headers are separated from the body, or payload as it's called, separated from the data by a blank line. And Stephen, and you'll notice here, by the way, they're telling you what result is. No except, they're not expecting to get anything back. So, Stephen.
Hey, yeah, and this could be because I'm at the end of the day and I could have just missed it. But are these requests not supposed to have like an authentication key in them or something?
They should. That's just been omitted.
Okay.
Probably because they got tired of pixelating it out. But yeah, in real life, there would have to be, and there'd have to be more headers in here, including, among other things, the authentication headers. Okay. Nope, you're exactly right. So, here's another patch, and now look what's happening here. We've got a question mark, so that marks the beginning of the query string, and then we've got all of this stuff. $select. Now they've screwed up. Okay, no, they haven't screwed up. So what they've done here is they've put in, after the query string, they've put in select. This is now starting to get into OData area. OData allows you, following the query string, to put in keywords. And the keywords all begin with a $sign. All begin with a $sign. $select allows you to say, please send me back these columns. So notice a default patch, they weren't expecting to get back any result at all. So they didn't even specify the accept that we saw on this one. They weren't expecting to get any data back. This one has said, I want you to send me back what the record looks like after the change. And I want the name column, the credit on hold, the address 1 latitude, description. I want all these columns back in here. And there you can see they've specified the content type. They're expecting to get this back as application JSON. Now when you're doing a patch, you have to provide a payload. You have to provide, what data you want changed. And so that's down here. They want the name column to be updated to updated sample account. So this is going to find this item, and there's the primary key up here in the URL, just like in a GET. So there's the and you're allowed to do that with a patch. Now what will happen is if it can't find an item 00000-001, then what it's going to do is attempt to create that record and set the name column to updated sample account. Now, if there's more required columns, that's going to fail. But I assume from and the person is asking for all this data back, I assume that whoever issued this query is confident that that account exists, and they want to get all the information back after the update. I suppose it may be that all of those columns have default values, and they're expecting the row to be added, and they want to see what the values in the default columns are going to be. So here's the response back. The response begins with the HTTP version and then your status code, which is 200 OK. And then there's the blank line, and there's the response. And again, they're using OData here. And OData, the OData context is the URL that was used to retrieve the data. And you can see they've put in $table, and that's, instead of listing off all the columns, $table says, send me all the columns in the table. They've also included the E tag. An E tag uniquely identifies this result. If you issue an OData request with an E tag, you should get back exactly what you got exactly what you received with this request. So that is an E tag. And then we finally get the actual data of the, so this table apparently has account ID, account category code, description, address 1, latitude. So that apparently, looking at this, that's the accounts table. Why are we getting this OData stuff? Are we going to get saddled with this every time we issue a query? No. The reason we're getting it is because they put in $metadata. So this is actually sending us information about the table, information about the query, and all of it. So this is metadata about the accounts table. Here's a put, and puts are always just updates. So this record has got to exist. Unlike a patch, the record will not be created. And it's going to update the value column to update its sample account name. Here's a delete, and no delete. Everything is in the URL. So there is the account we're updating. So I'm just trying to get you a feeling for the variety of things you can do with OData. We've got a couple of more things, but hopefully I can ask for data about the table. I can ask for individual call. I can specify which columns I want back. There's more to it than that. Okay, we've already talked about fetch XML, so we'll keep on. And here is another XML example. Here's a more complicated example, more extended example. We're going to the account table. We want 2 columns, account ID and name. We want account ID, name, and we're filtering here. We only want the ones where the address, state, or province column is equal to WA. So this instead of retrieving, this would retrieve all of the rows. This will retrieve only the rows where address 1 _ state or province is set to WA. You can write and execute fetch XML columns from, I guess I'm not, I think this is in Visual Studio. Don't care, quite frankly. Power Automate, you can call and trigger Power Automate actions, Power Automate flows from the Web API. So if you want to, you can issue Web API calls you can issue RESTful calls against the Dataverse to start a Power Automate workflow running, if you wish. Here's what that looks like. You do a post. Now, there's sort of a problem here. When you create a RESTful web service, what you're doing is creating a valid HTML request. And valid HTML requests always begin with the HTTP verb. And there's only about a dozen of them. And we don't even use all of them, really. We just use get, put, post, delete. A lot of sites never implement patch. They just get, put, post, and delete. So there really isn't a verb like run or execute to start a Power Automate workflow running. So what Microsoft decided to do was they decided to use the post verb. So if you want to start a Power Automate workflow running, you send a post request with the name of the Power Automate flow that you want to run. And then this is data that will be passed to, this is data that will be passed to the workflow, you know, that initial trigger that you can fill the data in. And this is the table that it would be tied to. Actually, the row in the table, I'm being too specific. That's the row in the opportunities table that this workflow is to execute against. So, and you can see that's, again, the OData query. There's the name of the table, and there's the ID that identifies the row in the table that you want. And there's a bunch of actions already built into the Dataverse that you can take advantage of. There are two kinds of, from the point of view of two kinds of workflows, workflows that are attached to a table and workflows that are not attached to a table. Since I regard the whole point of creating Power Apps as updating, managing tables, and workflows as a way of updating, managing entries in various tables, I sort of assume that they'll all be tied to some record in some table. But if you just omit that OData.bind statement, then hopefully the workflow knows what it's working with. So there you go. Occasionally you might need to run logic for another user, so you can, in the web API, you can add a message header. You can add an header called caller object ID, which has the credentials for a particular user. And as a result, that web API request will execute not as if you were doing it. Remember, you went through some authentication process, but it will now perform the action as if it was that user doing it. And so here is the way that ends the kinds of updates. There's the created by, and the created by will list the user, pretend this record is being created by so-and-so. And there is the owning user, and that's the user that, again, you're pretending to be. But notice the created on behalf by, that is the user who actually issued the request. So as far as audit trails go, it'll look like it's this user's record. This user, because they are listed as the owning user, this user will be able to update it. But we do have an audit trail that leads back to the person who actually issued the query that created this item. Let's look at the OData query over here. So there's the $select. So that's the rows we want back. $expand means that if there's a lookup table here, give me the fully expanded lookup table. So you'll notice that created by is apparently kept in a related table. And so it's going to grab that and expand it, give you all the information from that related table. And you can see that. Name, value, account ID, value, created by has got a whole bunch of values. Owning user is also going to be expanded. And I guess that's all they could fit in. You can also, if you wish, turn on change tracking for tables. And you can decide how much change tracking you want. Now, if you have a table that sees a lot of changes, that's going to substantially expand the amount of data this table needs. And when you signed your license, you got a limit on how much virtual disk space you are going to be allowed to use. But what it means is every time a user makes a change, a copy of the row before the change is kept. So if this is a row that gets changed 12 times in the day, you've got 12 copies of that row sitting there. Now, one of the fallouts from this is you can now, SQL has a feature called temporal queries that allow you to say, give me this row as it looked between this date and this date, or this time and this time on this date. So turning on change tracking, or change tracking, including change tracking for flows, means that if something goes harder, I said, why were we rejecting orders at 3 o'clock yesterday? If you've turned on change tracking, then you can go back to say, well, show me what those records look like at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Oh, that's why we thought we were out of stock at 3 o'clock afternoon. So if you've turned that on, you can now take advantage of OData for delta links. Now, what delta links let you do is they let you issue a request and put in this prefer header that says OData track changes. Now, let's take a look at this. There's the get verb. There's the URL. And here's our query, $, and select name, account number, telephone, fax. So those are the 4 columns we want back, and we want that back from the accounts table. So that's the URL. But we've turned on OData track changes. Now, what does that mean? It means that when we get back the response, we're going to have an entry called OData data link that contains our URL. So there's that exactly the same URL with $ select, name, telephone, slightly different, telephone number and fax. But notice there's something else that's been included. This $ delta token. It's way long, goes right there. And then we get our actual data that we've seen before. Now, the reason that's interesting is if we grab that URL that's got the delta token and, say, 2 days later, send this URL, as you see here with the delta token, we'll get back as many different versions of the row as there has been created over the last 2 days. If we've turned on that data tracking for flow, and turned on that, keeping all the copies of the record, then when we send a request and specify that we want to turn on track changes, we will get a URL back that includes the delta token. If we issue that URL with that identical delta token, in other words, if we store this away somewhere so we don't lose it and send it in our next request, what we will get back are all the copies of that record. So even if there's only one record, we're going to get, and it's been changed 4 times, we're going to get back 4 versions of that record, or potentially nothing if the record hasn't seen any changes since we issued it. So here is that issued again. I'm just going to count on that being the same delta token that we saw returned to us. And then apparently the record's, the record was changed once and then it was deleted. So there you go. That may be more than you want. One of the things you can do in OData, one of the keywords you can use in OData is $count, and instead of handing you back the rows, it just hands you back the number of rows. So if you use that in a delta request, what you get back is the number of changes that have been made. So what you're always getting is the changes since the last request. You have to enable this on a table-by-table basis because it does take up more space. If you're working with XRM, it's the retrieve entity changes request will generate the appropriate header. There's that delta token. You have to include that in the URL that you issue next time. It's only guaranteed to work for up to 90 days. So if you wait 91 days and issue it, you may get a response that's, oh, I'm sorry. And if they say set token to null for the initial, you don't send a token at all in the first request. So you just send the URL that describes the data you want back, and you specify in the header. And as you say, with XRM, that's the one that will put in that header for you. All right, let's talk about some Azure. And if you want to have a quiet nap now, I understand. And in fact, I'm going to do one thing to facilitate that. If you look at your dashboard, you will see that you now have 3 buttons: chime in, get assistance, and a button that will take you to the course evaluation. So let's look at what you can use in Azure. First off, if you don't like, Jacob, what's up?
Hey, sir, before you got started on Azure, or maybe we can do this afterwards, but I just wanted to ask you a quick question regarding connectors and accesses. I may have missed that portion of the course.
Yep.
But if you're giving an individual access to, for instance, the PowerApp, do they need to have access to the data list, the database list? And if so, how do you go about that, I guess?
Well, I don't think they need access to the connector. What they're going to need access to is the table that's loaded by the connector.
Yes. Okay. Yes. And that would just be modify access?
Okay. Well, that was a quick answer. Yeah. Okay. Well, whatever you want. You may want the user only to be able to read it. Or you may want them to be able to read it and modify it.
Okay, okay, I think
okay, that actually was a quick answer. So what can you do in Azure? Well, first off, there is the equivalent of Power Automate, our logic apps. Again, like Power Automate, it's a drag and drop visual programming tool designed to coordinate stuff. People say, should I use Logic Apps or Power Automate? I say, well, really doesn't matter. Any action you create, custom action you create for Power Automate will work in Logic Apps also. Azure Service Bus, if you're creating highly scalable applications, one of the ways you do it is when a request comes into your application, instead of processing it, you write it out to a queue. And you just write, and that takes no time at all. So this puts you in a position to process a lot of items in a short period of time. And then you create another process that reads items out of the queue and actually does the processing. So if you're overwhelmed with requests coming in, you may fall behind, and that queue gets longer and longer. But if, presumably at some time the demand will fall off, and midnight, and the processing will catch back up. This is the way Amazon works. This is why sometimes with Amazon you get an email immediately that, oh yes, we've got your order, and sometimes it takes a while because this is the model they use. And by the way, if you fall far enough behind, you can just start up another processor, and now you're going to pull stuff off the queue twice as fast. Azure Service Bus is one of the tools that you can use to implement this design. And with Power Apps, you can both read to and write from a service bus queue. Azure API Management allows you to set up web services and manage authentication for the web services, and then eventually write some code to go behind your web service. So I can set up in API Management, I'm going to have this API, it's going to have these, it's going to support these operations, you're going to have to pass these parameters. This is the authentication you need to get at them, and then later on I actually write the code that and tie it to that. Event Grid is another way of handling highly scalable applications. What happens is that when a request comes in, you fire an event and you put some data in it. And other objects are wired up to listen to that event. Listen for that event. So when that event fires, those objects react and process that event. And again, raising the event requires very little time at all. And you don't have to worry about missing an event. The events are queued up. If an event fires and you're too busy to respond to it, you can either set up to say, okay, well, if I'm too busy to respond to it, start another copy of me. Or you can say, just stack up those events and I'll work my way through them as the opportunity comes. That's actually both, I've just described both Event Grid and Event Hubs. Event Grid is there, it's waiting, it's built into Azure for you to use. Event Hubs, on the other hand, allow you to create your own custom event-driven application. If you don't want to use the Azure Event Grid, you can create an Event Hub that's just used by your application and the stuff that takes advantage of it. Stephen.